I was never the kind of person who believed in ghosts. But I was also never the kind to back down from a good dare. This happened about 8 years ago, back when I was still in high school. It was a Friday night, and the small town I lived in didn't offer much beyond urban legends and old places to explore. My best friend Jake and I were bored and decided it would be a good idea to challenge each other to visit the town's cemetery after dark. This wasn't just any cemetery. It was old, with weathered headstones and massive trees whose roots seemed to swallow the graves. Some of the headstones were said to date back to the 19th century, and the place was rumored to be haunted. To us, that was just another excuse to feel a thrill. We got there around 11 p.m., armed with nothing but our phone flashlights. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the sound of crickets and the wind rustling through the leaves. The place was even creepier than I imagined. The headstones were covered in moss, and the engravings were hard to read. The full moon cast just enough light to give everything a silver glow, but it also created shadows that made the place feel even more eerie. Jake, always the joker, started walking among the graves pretending to be a ghost, but I was more focused on not tripping over anything. That's when I noticed a figure moving in the distance, between the headstones. At first, I thought it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. You know how your mind does that when you're already on edge. But as we kept watching, it became clear it was a person, not a shadow. The figure was a man, looking rather unkempt. He had his back to us, crouching near a gravestone and holding what looked like a photograph. He was muttering something, but it was too low to make out. Jake motioned for us to get closer, probably thinking it was another curious explorer like us. I hesitated because there was something off about the way he moved. He kept glancing around quickly, like he was searching for something, but never fully lifted his head. It was almost as if he was talking to the headstones, murmuring names as he moved from one to another. It didn't make sense, but he didn't seem like someone who was just casually visiting. When we took one more step in his direction, the sound of a branch snapping under our feet made him turn toward us. I'll never forget the look he gave us. His eyes were sunken, with dark circles that looked more like stains on his face. He froze for a few seconds, just staring at us, but what struck me the most was the expression on his face. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something between desperation and rage. Suddenly, he yelled something that sounded like a name, but it came out garbled, like his throat was dry. Before we could figure out what was happening, he dropped the photograph on the ground and started running toward us. I didn't think twice. I grabbed Jake's arm and started running as fast as I could. The sound of his footsteps behind us was louder than the pounding of my own heart. We ran through the graves, not daring to look back, trying to find the cemetery's exit. The problem was that everything looked the same in the dark. Headstones appeared out of nowhere, and every wrong turn felt like it pushed us farther from the entrance. The sound of his footsteps behind us didn't stop, but the way he was calling out names was even worse. It wasn't like he was trying to scare us. It was like he was genuinely looking for someone, or something, and that made it even more terrifying. At one point, Jake tripped over a root and almost fell. "Get up!" I hissed through clenched teeth, trying not to shout, but the panic in my voice was obvious. He managed to regain his balance, and we kept running until we finally saw the rusted iron gate that led to the street. When we passed through the gate, the relief lasted only a few seconds. I turned back, expecting to see the man still chasing us, but he had stopped. He was standing right at the cemetery entrance, hands on his knees, breathing heavily. He didn't cross the gate, and that left me feeling uneasy. It was like he couldn't or wouldn't leave the cemetery. Still clutching Jake's arm, I pulled him farther away. We ran for a few more blocks before stopping in front of a 24-hour diner, the only place that felt bright and safe at the time. Our breaths were heavy, and neither of us could speak for a while. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I noticed something on my shoe. The photo the man had been holding was caught in my shoelace. I picked up the photo with trembling hands, sweat dripping down my face. It was an old picture, faded with time, showing a woman with a soft smile, wearing a floral dress that looked like it was from the 70s. Behind her, you could see a grave, but the name on the headstone was blurred, maybe from moisture or just wear. I showed the photo to Jake, but he just shook his head, unsure of what to say. "Do you think it was his wife? Or someone he lost?" he asked, still catching his breath. I couldn't answer. Something about that photo deeply unsettled me, like there was something wrong that I couldn't quite place. I decided to keep it in my pocket, promising myself I'd try to figure out what was going on the next day. We just wanted to get away and forget what had just happened. When I got home, I thought I'd have trouble sleeping, but exhaustion knocked me out as soon as I hit the bed. But the rest didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, like I was being watched. My bedroom window faced the backyard, and the wooden gate rarely made noise. But that night, I could hear it creaking in the wind, slow and unsettling. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but for some reason, I felt an irresistible urge to look out the window. I got up slowly, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. The yard was empty, but the gate was wide open. That was strange because I distinctly remembered locking it before going to bed. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. The next day, the strange feeling lingered. I decided to tell my mom about what had happened, but she just gave me a skeptical smile and said I must have dreamed it. Jake was also shaken. He messaged me early in the morning, saying he couldn't stop thinking about the man in the cemetery. After lunch, we decided to meet at the town library to do some research about the cemetery and hopefully find some clue about the photo I had found. As we flipped through old newspapers, Jake suddenly froze. He called me over with a pale expression, holding a yellowed edition of a local newspaper. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an article from a few months ago. The headline read, "Man disappears after searching for wife in cemetery." My stomach sank. The description in the article matched the man we had seen the night before. The story explained that the man, identified as David, had lost his wife in a car accident years ago and spent nights wandering the cemetery where she was buried, looking for something. But he had mysteriously disappeared months ago, and no one knew what had happened to him. The strangest part was that, according to the article, his wife's grave was in a specific corner of the cemetery, far from where we encountered him. We decided to go back during the day, even though the thought made us uneasy. When we arrived, the cemetery felt far less threatening in the sunlight, but one thing immediately caught our attention. The photograph I had picked up was no longer with me. I could have sworn I'd kept it in my pocket, but it had vanished without explanation. We walked to the area where the newspaper said David's wife was buried. The graves there seemed better maintained, but the atmosphere was still unsettling. We quickly found her headstone, marked with the name Emily, and an inscription that read, "We will meet again, my love." But something about the scene didn't feel right. Fresh flowers lay on the grave, as if someone had placed them there within the past day or two. I looked at Jake, but he seemed just as confused as I was. Who could have left those flowers if David had disappeared months ago? Stranger still, the dirt around the grave looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently. A chill ran down my spine, and Jake suggested we leave. I felt like we were meddling in something we shouldn't. Before we could go, though, something caught my eye. It was the photograph. It was partially buried in the ground near Emily's headstone. I picked it up carefully, and this time, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. In the background of the image, almost imperceptible, was a shadow. A dark silhouette, as if someone were standing behind Emily. My heart raced. "Jake, look at this," I said, showing him the photo. "Did you see this before?" He shook his head, his face filled with pure terror. We didn't say another word. We just left as fast as we could, swearing never to return. In the following days, I tried to forget what happened, but it felt like everything around me kept reminding me. Every fleeting shadow, every creak of the gate at night, brought me back to that night in the cemetery. I tried searching for more information about David's case, but every lead ended up being a dead end. No one knew where he was, and the case had gone cold. Jake and I stopped talking about it, as if ignoring it would make it all go away. But the feeling of being watched never really left me. Then, one night, as I was organizing my things, something fell to the floor. It was the photograph. The same photograph we had left at the cemetery. This time, there was something different about it. The shadow in the background looked sharper, almost as if it had moved closer. And even more chilling, Emily's expression in the photo seemed to have changed. The gentle smile now looked strained, almost like a cry for help. That's when I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. I took the photo to the police station, telling them I had found it in the cemetery. They seemed confused but agreed to investigate. They never told me anything about what they found. The photo disappeared again after that, and I chose not to ask. To this day, whenever I pass by the cemetery, I avoid looking inside. I don't know if David is still there, but something tells me he never really left that place, at least not completely. And I've never been able to feel entirely safe again, as if a part of me stayed behind in that night. I've been working as a night security guard at a cemetery for about 5 years. It's not a dream job, but it pays the bills, and the peace of the night shift suited me just fine. I'm not easily scared and actually enjoy solitude, so watching over graves and headstones in silence was never an issue. This happened back in April, on one of those nights where the temperature can't decide whether to cool down or stay warm. It was around 2 a.m. Yi and I was in my makeshift office inside a small guard shack near the main gate. At the time, we were dealing with a lot of trespassers, teenagers jumping the fence to drink or mess around. I usually handled it calmly, but that night was different. Everything started normally, but around 3 a.m., I saw a group sneaking in through the east side where the cameras were broken. I grabbed my flashlight and headed in their direction, ready to give them a warning and send them off, as usual. When I got closer, I realized this wasn't just some typical mischief. There were 4 teenagers, all wearing hoodies, crouched in a circle around an old grave. They had red candles lit around them, and one of them was holding what looked like a small knife. From where I stood, I could hear murmuring, but the words didn't make sense. It wasn't English, maybe Latin. My chest tightened a little. It was all too strange, but I figured it was just some internet trend or prank. Shining my flashlight on them, I yelled for them to knock it off. They jumped as if they'd been electrocuted and bolted in the opposite direction, leaving the candles burning and some items scattered on the ground. I waited until they were gone before moving closer, and what I found near the grave still haunts me. The headstone belonged to a woman named Alice, who had died in 1958. It was one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, with the stone weathered and the name almost unreadable. What caught my attention, though, was what the teenagers had left behind. There was a small pile of items: a dirty rag doll with one arm missing, a Polaroid photo of a couple I didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper with shaky, almost panicked handwriting. My curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded the paper. It had only one sentence: "The truth is buried, but it still listens." A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just a creepy prank. I gathered everything into a plastic bag, blew out the candles, and headed back to my shack, planning to hand the items over to the cemetery manager in the morning. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The doll, the photo, that cryptic message. There was something unsettling about it all. But things really took a turn on the 3rd night after the incident. One of the groundskeepers came to me in the morning, looking visibly shaken. He said that one of the graves had been disturbed. When we went to check, I saw it was the same grave where the teenagers had been doing their ritual. The soil was overturned as if someone had been digging, but not down to the coffin. It looked more like the dirt had been churned from within. There were no footprints or shovel marks, nothing that pointed to how it had been done. It didn't feel like normal vandalism. I looked around for any other clues, but the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, like the silence itself was watching me. I decided to stay more vigilant during my next shift. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just my imagination. During the night, I stayed near Alice's grave, watching for any signs that the teenagers might return or that someone else was involved. The hours dragged on, and the silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was a continuous sound, low and rhythmic, like murmuring coming from the direction of the grave. My flashlight felt weak as I pointed it toward the area, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. I took a deep breath and walked toward the grave, trying to keep my nerves in check. When I got there, everything looked normal, except for one new thing. On top of the headstone was a small cloth bag tied with a thick piece of string. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. When I opened it, I saw it was filled with teeth. Human teeth. They were dirty, some still with bits of flesh attached. My stomach turned, and I nearly dropped the bag. Who had left it there? And why? I locked the bag in the shack, along with the other strange items, and tried to finish my shift without thinking too much. But it was impossible. The murmuring seemed to follow me, echoing in every corner of the cemetery and even inside my own mind. The following night, even though I was off duty, I couldn't stay away. I brought a stronger flashlight and an audio recorder, determined to document anything unusual. I hopped the side gate, just like the teenagers had done, and headed straight for Alice's grave. The silence was oppressive, and that creeping sensation of being watched was stronger than ever. When I reached the grave, I noticed the soil had been disturbed even more. It looked like someone had dug again, deeper this time. My flashlight shook in my hand as I tried to steady my breathing. I turned on the recorder and began walking in slow circles around the grave, hoping to pick up any sounds. It didn't take long for the recorder to catch something my ears couldn't. At first, it was faint, like static, but then it became clearer, a low, mournful wailing that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to rise from beneath the ground itself, growing louder and more desperate. My heart was pounding, but instead of running, I grabbed an old shovel I'd spotted near the groundskeeper's shed earlier that day. I started digging, each shovel full of dirt making the sound intensify. When I struck something solid, I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But curiosity, or maybe something else entirely, pushed me forward. I uncovered what looked like a crude wooden plank, not part of the original coffin, but something placed there recently. I wedged the shovel under the edge of the plank and pried it loose. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, revealing a deep, narrow hole beneath it. A foul stench hit me immediately, so strong it made my eyes water. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness below, but what I could see made my stomach drop. Bones, human bones, were arranged in intricate patterns, forming symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't just piled up, they were deliberately placed, almost ritualistic. As I stared, frozen in shock, the recorder in my pocket began to emit a loud static noise, followed by a piercing scream that didn't sound entirely human. It was a mix of anguish and rage, distorted in a way that made my chest tighten with fear. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. But there was nothing. The air felt charged, heavy, like the atmosphere before a violent storm. I turned back to the hole, but I couldn't bring myself to climb down. Something deep inside me screamed that if I went any further, I wouldn't make it out alive. My instincts finally took over, and I began shoveling the dirt back into the hole as fast as I could. The mournful wailing from the recorder faded as I buried the opening, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. I finished covering the hole, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the shovel. I stood there for a moment, staring at the grave, trying to convince myself that it was over. But the cemetery was different now. The silence wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, almost as if the air itself was watching me. I grabbed the recorder and flashlight, barely able to think straight, and sprinted back to the gate. The moment I stepped outside, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. The world seemed brighter, more real. But my fear didn't leave me. The next morning, I went straight to the cemetery manager, Mark. He was a quiet, no-nonsense kind of guy, the type you wouldn't expect to believe in anything remotely supernatural. But when I told him what I'd seen and played the recording, his face turned pale. He sat silently for a moment, then stood up, walked to his desk, and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without a word, he handed it to me. Inside was cash, not a fortune, but enough to make it clear he wanted me to drop the issue. "Don't dig any deeper, literally or figuratively," he said, his voice flat. "It's not your problem." I quit that job the same day. I didn't even go back to get my things from the guard shack. Whatever was happening in that cemetery, I wanted no part of it. To this day, I don't fully understand what I uncovered that night, but I still have the recorder. Sometimes, when I'm alone and brave enough to listen to the audio, I notice something chilling. The scream grows louder with each playback, as if it's getting closer to me. I've thought about destroying the recorder, but I can't bring myself to do it. A part of me still wants answers, even though I'm terrified of what I might find. Working at a cemetery was never something I imagined myself doing, but back in 2018, I needed the money and accepted the job as a night caretaker at a small cemetery in my hometown. At the time, my life was pretty simple. I lived alone in a rented apartment downtown, spent most of my free time watching shows and playing video games, and only saw my family occasionally. I wasn't scared of the cemetery itself. In fact, I thought it would be a quiet, almost therapeutic job. My shift started at 10 p.m. and lasted until 6 a.m. My only responsibilities were to walk around the grounds a few times and monitor the security cameras from a small control room. Usually, it was just me and the dead silence. That night, everything seemed normal. The clock read around 1 a.m., and I was finishing up reviewing the footage from the last few hours, something I did out of habit, even though nothing interesting ever showed up. Then I heard it for the first time. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me because it sounded so faint and distant. It was a rhythmic sound, like firm knocks on the building's walls. Knock, knock, knock. It paused for a few seconds and then started again. The weird part was that the control room was in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by open grounds. There was no way anyone could knock on the walls without me seeing them through the window or on the cameras. I stood still for a few moments, trying to figure out what could be causing the noise. I looked out the window, but only saw the silent rows of headstones scattered across the grounds, with the shadows of the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place. I decided to check the live camera feeds. The screens showed the usual angles: the empty main gate, the motionless rows of tombstones, and the deserted parking lot. Yet, the knocking continued. Now it was closer, almost as if someone was circling the building and knocking on the walls at regular intervals. My chest tightened. I'm not someone who scares easily, but there was something deeply unsettling about the situation. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to step outside, even though the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I've always been skeptical, so I thought it was probably some kids playing a prank or maybe an animal brushing against the building. When I opened the door, the cold night air hit me like a wall, and the silence was almost suffocating. I walked slowly around the building, shining my flashlight into every corner. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything touching the walls. Just the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees. When I went back inside, a shiver ran down my spine. The moment I shut the door, the knocking started again, this time from the opposite side of the building I had just checked. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but I didn't have the nerve to go back outside. Instead, I went straight to the monitor and reviewed the recordings from the last few minutes. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of one of the screens, near a row of tombstones, there was a figure. I couldn't see their face, but they were wearing a hooded jacket, walking slowly across the grounds. The strangest thing was that, despite the wind, the hood didn't move, as if it was glued to their head. I rewound the footage, trying to make sense of it. None of the gate alarms had gone off, and the cemetery's fences were tall enough to keep out any ordinary person. I decided to call the police. Not because I thought it was something supernatural, but because, honestly, I didn't want to deal with whatever it was alone. While I waited, I kept watching the cameras. The figure would disappear and reappear, always in the darkest, most distant parts of the grounds. Every time they vanished from the screen, I felt a knot in my stomach. For a moment, I thought they were getting closer to the control room, but then I lost sight of them entirely. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation and showed them the footage. They assured me they would do a full search and asked me to stay inside while they checked the grounds. I stayed in the control room, trying to calm down while listening to the officers' footsteps outside. They were talking to each other over their radios, but what unsettled me the most was the absolute silence around the cemetery. After about 15 minutes, one of them came back to the control room to tell me what they had found, and that's when things took an even darker turn. Scattered across the cemetery were several freshly dug shallow holes. They weren't graves. They weren't deep enough for that. Some were smaller, about a foot or two deep, while others looked like they had been abandoned halfway through digging. The officer tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just vandalism, but I could tell even he didn't believe that. When I asked about the person in the footage, he said they hadn't found anyone. No footprints other than their own, no signs of anyone being there that night. I insisted, showing him the recordings again, but he just shook his head and said they'd take the footage back to the station for further review. After another hour of searching, the police decided to leave, telling me to call them again if I saw or heard anything unusual. I was alone again, with the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. Once the officers were gone, the silence felt even heavier. Even with all the lights on in the control room, I felt vulnerable. I decided to review older footage, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. As I went through the recordings from previous nights, something began to disturb me. At different times, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., the same hooded figure appeared in various parts of the cemetery. Always at a distance, always in the darkest areas. Sometimes, they seemed to just stand and stare at the tombstones. Other times, they walked slowly in a straight line, almost as if they were counting steps. The more I watched, the more unsettling details I noticed. The figure never looked directly at the cameras, but in one recording, I saw them crouch near one of the spots where the officers had found a hole. They seemed to dig with their hands, but they never removed anything from the ground. It was as if the sole purpose was to dig the holes and then leave. That realization sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of ritual? A disturbed person trying to scare the caretaker? Or was it something I didn't even want to consider? The rest of the night dragged on, but I knew I wouldn't be able to relax as long as I stayed there alone. Around 4 in the morning, I decided I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and a piece of pipe I found in the storage closet, something to make me feel a little safer, and headed to the area where the figure had been digging in the video. The ground was still disturbed, the soil loose and damp like it had been freshly dug. I crouched down and began poking around, hoping to find some clue as to what this person had been doing. But no matter how much I moved the dirt, there was nothing. No objects, no markings, no explanation. It was just soil, like the act of digging itself was the point. While I was kneeling there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a sound that made my entire body freeze. It wasn't the knocking on the walls this time, but something deeper, almost like a muffled groan coming from far away. I turned my head toward the sound and caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the cemetery near a cluster of trees. My hand trembled as I shone my flashlight in that direction. For a split second, I thought I saw the hood of the figure, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. But before I could react, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back as I stood there, frozen. I couldn't bring myself to stay outside any longer. I rushed back to the control room, locking the door behind me, and immediately checked the cameras. Once again, there was nothing. No sign of movement, no figure, no explanation. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that maybe I was too tired, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I sat back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing, when the monitors suddenly flickered. At first, I thought it was a glitch in the system, but when the feeds came back, all the cameras were pointed at the same thing, the holes scattered across the cemetery. That was impossible. The cameras were fixed in place and could only be adjusted manually, one by one. Yet here they were, all focusing on the disturbed patches of soil. My stomach churned, and I felt a wave of nausea as I stared at the screens. Then I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. In one of the feeds, the hooded figure was back. This time, they weren't walking or digging. They were standing completely still, their back to the camera, facing one of the holes. I couldn't move. I just sat there, watching, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't move. They stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. I sat there, paralyzed, unable to look away from the screen. The figure didn't budge, didn't even twitch. It was as if they were waiting for something. My hands hovered over my phone, debating whether to call the police again. But part of me wondered if it would even make a difference. What could I tell them? That the cameras had somehow moved on their own? That this hooded figure kept appearing and disappearing without a trace? The longer I stared, the more a sinking dread began to fill me, as though whatever was out there wasn't just a person playing pranks. It was something far worse. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, the next the screen went blank for a second, and when it came back, the feed showed only the empty cemetery. I quickly scanned all the camera angles, but it was like they had vanished into thin air. I couldn't stay there anymore. As soon as my shift ended at 6 a.m., I packed up my things and left without looking back. The fresh morning light did little to ease my nerves, and I felt like the eyes of that figure were still on me, even as I walked out of the gates. I took a few days off to process what had happened, though the unease never really left me. During that time, I tried digging into the cemetery's history. I looked for anything that might explain what I saw, but there was nothing unusual. No strange events, no legends, no reports of trespassers. It was just an old cemetery with a long history of silence. I even considered going back to confront my fears and figure out what was happening. But every time I thought about stepping foot in that place again, a cold, irrational terror washed over me. Eventually, I decided to quit the job. I sent in my resignation and never returned. Weeks later, I got a call from a friend who still worked at the cemetery. He told me the holes had started appearing again, fresh ones, in the same shallow, irregular shapes. He said they've increased security, but no one has ever seen who's digging them or why. I haven't told him everything I saw that night. I don't think he'd believe me anyway, but the thought of those holes still haunts me. What were they for? Why were they being dug? And who or what was doing it? I still don't have any answers. All I know is that whatever was out there that night, I hope I never encounter it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking in my head, a rhythmic knock, 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 like a warning that whatever it was isn't finished yet. I worked as a part-time caretaker in a small cemetery in the countryside. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me time to study at night. The place was quiet, isolated, surrounded by a forest that seemed to grow denser as the sun went down. It was late October, and the weather was already starting to get colder. Dry leaves covered the stone paths between the graves, crunching underfoot. I didn't have much to do except sweep the paths and make sure no headstones had been damaged. At least, that was the case until that day. That morning, while I was adjusting some flowers that a visitor had dropped, an older woman approached me, visibly uneasy. She said she had heard strange sounds coming from the old mausoleum in the farthest corner of the cemetery. I chuckled awkwardly and tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just the wind or an animal. But she cut me off with a serious look. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like whispers, someone talking inside. I promised to check it out, but honestly didn't give it much thought. That mausoleum had been there for decades, always locked and abandoned. Who would worry about it? After the woman left, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to complain about odd things. The cemetery, after all, already had a naturally eerie vibe. But the way she spoke, as if she truly believed someone was inside, stuck with me. When my shift was almost over, I decided to swing by the mausoleum just to make sure everything was fine. It was a small building, made of dark stone, with carved details that had long been worn away. The letters spelling the family name, Whitaker, were barely legible on the facade. The large iron gate looked intact from a distance, but as I got closer, I noticed it was slightly ajar. That was strange. The mausoleum had a heavy lock that hadn't been opened since I started working there. I pushed the gate slowly, and it creaked with a metallic groan that echoed in the empty space. Inside, the late afternoon light filtered through the cracks in the stone, illuminating dust floating in the air. The interior was empty. No coffins, no urns, nothing. Just a stained marble floor and walls marked where niches had clearly been occupied before. My heart started pounding. I knew I wasn't allowed to mess with anything there, but it didn't take a genius to realize this wasn't normal. I walked out of the mausoleum with a lump in my throat, trying to process what I had just seen. As I locked the gate, I noticed something strange on the ground, marks in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged out. They disappeared into the tall grass surrounding the building. As much as I wanted to investigate, the sun was already setting, and the cemetery had a way of feeling more menacing at night. I decided to report what I'd seen to the manager the next day, but that night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that empty space, as if something was lurking, waiting for me to return. The next day, when I arrived at work, I was greeted by whispers from visitors and suspicious glances. One of the office staff, a woman named Linda, pulled me aside and asked if I'd heard the rumors. According to her, some townspeople were saying they'd seen a strange man wandering the cemetery at night. The description was always the same: a tall figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of the 19th century. He never interacted with anyone, just walked slowly, always heading toward the mausoleum. When I asked why no one had warned me before, she shrugged, saying they thought it was just people making up stories. But the coincidence unsettled me. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. During my shifts, I always made a point to check the mausoleum, just to see if anything had changed. For a few days, everything seemed normal. No one mentioned sounds or strange figures, and I almost managed to convince myself that maybe the stories were just exaggerations. But then, on a Friday night, I decided to stay a little later to organize some tools in the shed. The cemetery was silent, with that kind of stillness that makes even the smallest noise seem deafening. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like the sound of leaves being dragged by the wind. But there was a rhythm to it. It sounded like footsteps. I dropped everything and went to the shed's window, which offered a partial view of the mausoleum. In the darkness, I saw a silhouette. It was a tall man with broad shoulders and a hat that looked like something out of an old movie. He walked slowly but with purpose and disappeared through the mausoleum's entrance. My blood ran cold. I was absolutely certain no one else was supposed to be there, let alone entering a place that was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the building, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I walked toward the mausoleum, trying not to dwell on what I had just seen. With every step, my heart pounded louder than the crunch of dried leaves beneath my feet. When I finally reached the gate, it was ajar again. This didn't make sense. I had locked it myself days ago, and I knew no one but the manager had the key. I shined my flashlight inside, hesitating to step in. The interior was the same empty space as before, but something felt off. The air was icy, much colder than outside, and there was a strange smell like damp earth and iron. I took one cautious step inside, the creak of the floor echoing like a muffled scream. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something scratching against the marble, like nails or metal being dragged across the walls. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But in the farthest corner, where the light barely reached, I saw movement. It was like a shadow, but it had form. Something almost human, but wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I felt an oppressive weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push me out. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps echoed again, this time from outside the mausoleum, growing closer. I turned toward the gate, but no one was there. Survival instinct took over, and I bolted out of the mausoleum without looking back. When I reached the outside, the sound of footsteps stopped, but the surroundings felt even stranger. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the cemetery was shrouded in a darkness that felt thick, almost tangible. I felt like I was being watched. My whole body was tense, and when I glanced back at the mausoleum, the same figure from before was standing in the doorway, staring at me. But this time, something about it seemed different. Like it was just a reflection, a memory, and yet unnervingly real. I couldn't move for what felt like an eternity until the figure took one step forward. That was enough to send me running back to the shed, where I locked the door and stayed until sunrise. I don't know how I managed it, but I spent the rest of the night hiding, clutching a metal rod as if it could protect me from something I couldn't even understand. The next day, I quit. I told the manager what had happened, but he just laughed and said stories about the mausoleum were nothing new. Since then, I've avoided going near that cemetery. Sometimes, when I think about it, I can still smell that iron and damp earth. And even though no one believes me, I know something is wrong with that place. Something that was meant to stay locked away forever.
Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The apartment was dead quiet when I got home from my afternoon economics lecture that Thursday, in October 2022. I was 21, junior year at State College, living in this cramped two-bedroom place about 15 minutes from campus, with my roommate Jason, who worked nights at a warehouse. The building was one of those converted old houses from the 60s, split into 4 units, with paper-thin walls and radiators that clanged like someone was hitting them with a hammer. I remember dropping my backpack by the couch and heading straight to the kitchen, because I hadn't eaten since breakfast. Just grabbed a granola bar on my way out that morning. The dishes from yesterday were still piled in the sink, and I could smell that weird musty odor that always came up from the basement through the vents when it rained. Outside, the street was empty except for Mrs. Novak's orange tabby cat sitting on the fence post, watching nothing in particular the way cats do. I was spreading peanut butter on bread when I heard the front door open and close. Not unusual. Jason sometimes came home between his shifts to grab dinner or change clothes, and he had this habit of never announcing himself, just walking in like a ghost. The door made that specific scraping sound against the frame that I'd been meaning to fix for months, but never got around to. I kept making my sandwich, heard footsteps moving through the living room, that familiar creak of the third floorboard from the wall that always gave under any weight. "You're home early," I called out, but got no answer, which was typical Jason behavior when he was tired. The footsteps continued down the hallway toward his room, and I heard what sounded like him going into the bathroom. The door handle there had this loose rattle that you'd recognize anywhere. I finished making my sandwich, grabbed a Coke from the fridge, and was about to head to my room to start on my statistics homework when I noticed Jason's work boots by the front door. The brown Timberlands with the paint splatter on the left toe that he wore every single day to the warehouse. My whole body went rigid, like every muscle locked up at once. If Jason's boots were here by the door, then whoever was walking around in our apartment wasn't Jason. I stood there in the kitchen, sandwich in one hand, can of Coke in the other, trying to process what this meant, while my brain kept insisting there had to be some explanation. Maybe he had other shoes? But no, Jason only owned those boots and a pair of beat-up Nikes he wore to the gym. The footsteps had stopped now, and the apartment had gone completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock above the stove. I set down my food as quietly as I could on the counter, wincing when the can made a small metallic tap against the formica. My phone was in my backpack in the living room, might as well have been on the moon. I grabbed a knife from the dish rack, just a regular kitchen knife, nothing special, but it was something. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, just bolt out the front door and call the cops from outside. But I kept thinking maybe I was overreacting, maybe there was some explanation. And besides, all my stuff was here. My laptop with all my schoolwork, my wallet on my desk, everything. I moved toward the hallway, trying to avoid the squeaky spots in the floor I knew by heart from late-night trips to the bathroom. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, 5 doors total. Bathroom on the left, linen closet, Jason's room, my room at the end, and the laundry room on the right. All the doors were closed except the laundry room, which was open about halfway, just darkness visible through the gap. That door was never closed properly anyway, because the frame was warped and you had to really yank it shut. I was about 3 feet from the laundry room door when I heard breathing that wasn't mine, slow and controlled, coming from inside that darkened space. I pushed the door open with the tip of the knife, and there he was. A man crouched down between the washer and the dryer, holding a crowbar across his knees. He was maybe 45, wearing a faded denim jacket despite the warm weather, work pants with dried mud on the knees and these scuffed yellow construction boots. His face had that weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, deep lines around his eyes, stubble that was going gray, and he had this calm expression like I'd just caught him tying his shoe instead of hiding in my laundry room. The crowbar had scratches all along its length and what looked like rust or maybe old paint at the curved end. He didn't jump up or try to run. He just shifted his weight slightly, still crouching, and looked at me with these pale blue eyes that didn't blink nearly enough. The laundry room smelled like fabric softener and something else, maybe cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, and I could see he'd moved our detergent bottles around on the shelf above the machines. "Hey there," he said, and his voice was weirdly casual, like we were neighbors meeting at the mailbox. He stood up slowly, keeping the crowbar low at his side, not threatening exactly, but not putting it down either. "Real sorry about this. I thought this place was vacant. The lady at the rental office, short woman with the glasses and the lisp, she told me Unit 2B was empty, and I could take a look around before the showing tomorrow." His story came out smooth, rehearsed, but Unit 2B was Mrs. Novak's place downstairs, and she'd lived there for 15 years. He took a small step forward, just enough to make me step back, and I noticed he was positioned perfectly to block my view of whatever was behind him in the corner of the laundry room. Stupid mistake on my part. Must have gotten the numbers mixed up. You know how these old buildings are, the numbers on the doors are all worn off. Except our door had a brand new brass number that Jason installed last month after the old one fell off. The way he kept talking, maintaining that fake friendly tone while gripping the crowbar, made my skin prickle all over. I could see now what he'd been blocking. Our toolbox was open on the floor, and Jason's electric drill was sitting next to it along with a handful of other things I couldn't quite make out. "I should go," he said, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he angled his body slightly like he was going to try to squeeze past me in the narrow hallway. Really sorry about the confusion. I'll just head out and call the rental office, straighten this whole thing out. He was close enough now that I could see a scar running through his left eyebrow. Could smell that cigarette smoke mixed with something metallic. Maybe WD-40 or some other industrial smell. The crowbar shifted in his grip, and I saw his knuckles had old scars across them. The kind you get from punching things. My own hand was getting sweaty around the knife handle, and I knew he could see it trembling slightly. "You need to leave right now," I said, surprised my voice came out steady when everything inside me was screaming. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like he was doing math in his head, calculating something. Then he smiled, not a big smile, just this small upturn at the corners of his mouth that made my chest go tight. "Sure thing, kid. No harm done, right? Just a misunderstanding." He moved past me then, so close that the crowbar brushed against my leg, the metal cold even through my jeans. I turned to keep facing him as he walked down the hallway, never putting my back to him, and he moved with this deliberate slowness like he wanted me to know he wasn't scared, wasn't rushing. When he reached the living room, he stopped and looked around, taking in the TV, Jason's PlayStation, my backpack on the floor. "Nice place you got here, real nice." Then he walked to the front door, opened it and stepped out onto the landing. But before closing it, he looked back at me and said, "You should really lock this door, kid. Anybody could walk in." The door clicked shut, and I heard his footsteps going down the stairs unhurried, taking their time. I rushed to the door and turned the deadbolt, then the chain lock, then stood there with my forehead pressed against the wood, trying to stop the shaking that had taken over my whole body. Through the peephole, I could see him standing in the front yard, looking up at our window, just standing there in broad daylight like he owned the place. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, then walked to a van parked across the street. A white Ford Econoline with no windows in the back, some kind of company logo on the side that was too faded to read. He got in but didn't drive away immediately, just sat there for maybe 2 minutes while I watched through the peephole, my legs starting to cramp from standing on my toes. Finally, the van started up with a rough idle that needed engine work, and he pulled away slowly, taking a right at the stop sign. I grabbed my phone from my backpack and called 911, my fingers fumbling with the numbers twice before I got it right. The cops showed up about 20 minutes later. 2 officers, one older guy with gray at his temples who did most of the talking, and a younger woman who took notes and photos of the laundry room. They found Jimmy marks on the front door lock that I hadn't noticed, fresh scratches in the brass where he'd worked the crowbar before, just turning the handle and walking in because I'd forgotten to lock it after getting home. In the laundry room, they found more than I'd seen. He'd collected Jason's drill, a socket wrench set, an old tablet Jason kept in there for playing music while doing laundry, and weirdly a box of our laundry detergent pods. Probably grabbing anything he could sell, the older cop said, bagging the items as evidence even though they were ours. They asked me to describe him and I did my best, but when they ran it through their system, nothing definitive came up. "These guys usually work a neighborhood for a while," the female officer told me. "Hit places during work hours when they think no one's home. You were lucky. Most of the time when they get caught inside, it goes differently." Jason came home while the cops were still there, walked in to find our apartment full of uniforms and immediately went pale. After I explained everything, he just kept saying, "Jesus Christ," over and over, walking through the apartment, checking things, double-checking the windows, testing the locks. The cops gave us a case number and said a detective might follow up, but they were honest about the chances of catching the guy, unless he tries this again and someone else calls it in, or we get lucky with prints. The prints they lifted from the crowbar and doorknob didn't match anything in the system. That night, neither of us could sleep. We pushed the couch against the front door, and Jason slept in the living room with a baseball bat while I stayed in my room with the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. Every sound in that old building, the radiator clanging, footsteps from upstairs, a car door slamming outside, had us both jumping up to check the peephole. We stayed like that for 3 weeks, taking turns sleeping, installing new deadbolts, a door alarm, even a security camera that Jason's brother helped us mount above the entrance. Then one afternoon, Jason called me from work, his voice strange and tight. "Check the news," he said. "Channel 7, they just showed his picture." The man with the crowbar had been arrested 2 towns over after a homeowner shot him when he broke into the wrong house, a place where the owner was homesick from work, armed and ready. He'd survived, and when they searched his van, they found stolen items from dozens of homes, including Jason's drill with his initials carved into the handle. His name was Gregory Fulton, 47 years old, with a record going back 20 years for burglary, assault, and possession. The news showed his mugshot, and there were those pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough. That same thin-lipped mouth, though now bruised and swollen from his encounter with the armed homeowner. They said he'd been targeting college neighborhoods specifically because students were predictable, careless about locking doors, and unlikely to be armed. We got Jason's drill back eventually, after the trial where Gregory got 15 years, but we'd already moved out by then. Found a place on the 3rd floor of a building with a doorman, security cameras, and doors that locked automatically. Still checked them twice before bed, though. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when everything changed for me. I was 28, living alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of Denver, working remotely as a graphic designer for a marketing firm downtown. The house was nothing special, a 2-bedroom ranch from the 60s with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was mine, at least for the time being, and after years of roommates and shared spaces, having my own place felt like freedom. That particular day had been ordinary, almost boring even. I'd spent hours tweaking logos for a client who kept changing their mind, had a frozen burrito for lunch, and was planning to binge some true crime documentary before bed. The sun had set around 5, and by 7, the neighborhood was that peculiar kind of quiet you only get in residential areas during weeknight evenings. I was getting ready to meet up with my friend Megan later that week, and she'd been bugging me about what I was planning to wear to this art gallery opening she'd gotten us tickets for. Standing in my bedroom, I'd finally settled on this black dress I'd bought months ago but never worn. The tags were still on it, and I wanted to make sure it actually looked decent before committing to it. My bedroom mirror was perfect for outfit checks, one of those full-length ones I'd gotten from Target that leaned against the wall at just the right angle. I grabbed my phone, positioned myself to get the whole outfit in frame, and started snapping a few photos. The lighting in my bedroom was actually pretty good at that time of evening. The overhead fixture mixed with the warm glow from my bedside lamp created this soft, flattering effect that made everything look better than it probably was. After taking maybe 5 or 6 shots, I was scrolling through them, trying to pick the best one to send to Megan. You know how it is with mirror selfies. The first few are always trash, your face looks weird, or the angle makes your proportions all wrong. I was about to delete the 3rd photo when something caught my eye. In the mirror's reflection, beyond my bedroom doorway, I could see straight through to part of my kitchen. The layout of my house was pretty open. From my bedroom, you could see down the hallway into the living room and catch a glimpse of the kitchen beyond. But there, in the darker part of the kitchen near the breakfast nook, was something that shouldn't have been there. It was like a dark mass taller than my kitchen table, but not quite defined enough to make out clearly in the photo. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow from the refrigerator, or possibly my winter coat, that I sometimes threw over the kitchen chairs. But the longer I stared at that photo, zooming in and adjusting my phone's brightness, the more wrong it looked. The shape was too tall, too human-like in its proportions. It seemed to be standing near the sliding glass door that led to my backyard, just at the edge of where the kitchen light reached. My brain was doing that thing where it tries to rationalize what you're seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe something had fallen and was leaning against the wall. Maybe my eyes were just tired from staring at screens all day. I even took another selfie right then, same angle, same position, just to compare. The new photo showed the same view into the kitchen, but that dark shape wasn't there anymore. The breakfast nook was empty, just my little round table with its mismatched chairs, the pile of mail I'd been meaning to sort through, and the ceramic bowl where I dropped my keys every day. The rational part of my brain was telling me to just forget about it and send Megan the damn photo already. But I couldn't stop comparing the two images, swiping back and forth between them on my phone. In the first one, that shape was definitely there. Dark, solid, and absolutely should not have been in my kitchen at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night when I lived alone. My chest started feeling tight, that weird sensation you get when your body knows something's wrong before your brain fully accepts it. I set my phone down on the bed and just listened. The house was quiet except for the usual sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the heating system clicking on, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Nothing out of place. I grabbed my phone again, turned on the flashlight feature, and slowly walked out of my bedroom. The hallway felt longer than usual, and I kept the light trained ahead of me even though the living room lamp was on. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it after dinner. A single plate in the sink, a glass with a little bit of water still in it, the dishwasher humming through its cycle. I stood there for a moment, scanning every corner, checking behind the breakfast bar, even opening the pantry door to peer inside. Nothing. Nobody. Just my regular kitchen with its outdated linoleum and the collection of succulents dying slowly on the windowsill. But then my eyes landed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, and everything in my body went cold. The lock was turned to the open position, and the door itself was open maybe 2 or 3 inches. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough that the November air was creeping in, making the vertical blinds sway slightly. I never, ever left that door unlocked. I was obsessive about it, actually, checking it every night before bed, sometimes twice just to be sure. Standing there staring at that open door, I had 2 choices: grab my keys and run to my car, or check if someone was still in the house. The smart choice would have been to leave immediately, but I needed my car keys, and those were sitting in that ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, which meant walking closer to the open door. I grabbed a knife from the block on the counter, the biggest one I had, some ridiculous chef's knife I'd bought during a brief phase when I thought I'd learned to cook properly. The weight of it in my hand was both reassuring and terrifying because it meant I was accepting that someone had been, or might still be, in my house. I used my foot to push the sliding door completely closed, turned the lock with shaking fingers, and then jammed the security bar into place, the one I usually forgot to use. The backyard was dark, just the faint outline of my neighbor's fence and the shed I never used visible in the moonlight. That's when I heard it, a sound from the other side of the house. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being moved or shifted. It came from the direction of the spare bedroom, the one I used as a home office. My laptop was in there, along with some camera equipment and a few other electronics. The door to that room was closed, which was wrong because I always left it open to let the heat circulate better. I stood in my kitchen, gripping that knife, trying to decide what to do. The sound came again. Definitely something moving in there, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. My phone was still in my bedroom, sitting uselessly on the bed where I'd left it. The smart thing would be to leave right now, get to my car, drive away, and call the police from somewhere safe. But something made me need to know what was happening in my own house. Who had the audacity to come into my space? I moved through the living room as quietly as I could, avoiding the squeaky spot near the coffee table that I'd learned about from late-night snack runs. The spare bedroom door was about 15 feet away, and I could see a thin line of light coming from underneath it. Not the overhead light, but something dimmer, maybe the desk lamp. As I got closer, the sounds became clearer. It was definitely someone going through things, the distinctive sound of papers being shuffled, drawers being opened. They weren't even trying to be that quiet anymore, probably thinking I was still in my bedroom taking selfies like an idiot. I positioned myself to the side of the door, knife held high, and reached for the doorknob with my free hand. The metal was cold, and I could feel my pulse in my throat as I turned it slowly. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open fast and hard, letting it bang against the wall. There was a man in my office, crouched next to my desk with my external hard drive in his hands. He wasn't what I expected, not some hulking, intimidating figure, but a skinny guy, maybe early 30s, wearing jeans and a faded Broncos hoodie. His face went white when he saw me, and for a second, we both just stared at each other. He had watery blue eyes and a patchy beard, and there was a backpack on the floor next to him that looked like it was already half full with my stuff. The desk lamp was on, casting weird shadows across the room, and I could see my laptop was missing from its usual spot. "Get out," I heard myself say, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Get out of my house right now." The knife was still in my hand, pointed at him, and I think we were both equally shocked by the situation. He dropped the hard drive, and it clattered on the hardwood floor, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. "Lady, I don't want any trouble," he said, raising his hands slightly but not standing up yet. His voice was higher than I expected, nervous and scratchy. "I thought nobody was home. Your car wasn't in the driveway." That's when I remembered. I'd parked in the garage that day because I'd gotten groceries and didn't want to carry them as far. This pathetic man had been watching my house, learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment. The violation of it all hit me like a physical force. I said, "Get out." This time I screamed it, taking a step forward with the knife. That got him moving. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his backpack, and my laptop fell out of it onto the floor with a sickening crack. We both looked at it for a split second, then he bolted past me, careful to stay out of knife range. I followed him through the living room, watched him fumble with the front door lock. Apparently he'd come in through the back but planned to leave through the front like a regular visitor. The moment he was out, I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, and put the chain on. Through the peephole, I watched him run down my driveway and disappear into the darkness of the street. No car that I could see. He must have parked somewhere else or come on foot. My legs finally gave out, and I slid down against the door, still clutching that ridiculous knife. That's when I remembered my phone and practically crawled back to my bedroom to get it. I called 911, and while I waited for the police, I noticed something that made my skin prickle all over again. In my closet, several of my dresser drawers were slightly open. He'd been in my bedroom too, going through my things while I was standing right there, completely oblivious, taking photos in the mirror. The police found his entry point. He'd removed the screen from my home office window and jimmied it open. They said I was lucky, that confronting him could have gone much worse. But I don't feel lucky. I moved out 2 weeks later, broke my lease and everything. That house never felt safe again, knowing someone had been walking through my rooms, touching my things, watching me without my knowledge. I was 17 that summer, staying at my dad's place in Phoenix while he was away on a business trip to Seattle. He'd just gotten divorced from my stepmom earlier that year, and the house felt different without her around, emptier somehow, with all her knickknacks gone from the shelves and her smell no longer lingering in the hallways. Dad trusted me enough to leave me alone for a week, figured I was old enough to handle myself. I spent most of my days playing video games in the living room and eating cereal for dinner, enjoying the freedom of not having anyone tell me to clean my room or turn the music down. The neighborhood was one of those quiet suburban areas where the biggest excitement was when someone got a new car or painted their fence a different color. It was a Sunday night in July when everything went sideways, around 2 in the morning when the heat finally started to break and you could actually breathe without feeling like you were drowning in hot soup. I'd been tossing and turning for hours, my sheets damp with sweat because the AC unit in my room had been making this weird clicking noise for days and barely pushed out any cold air. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway, and from my bed I had a clear view straight through my open door, down the hall, and into part of the kitchen if I propped myself up on my elbow. I always slept with my door open because the house got better airflow that way, and honestly, being alone in that big, empty house made me feel less isolated when I could hear the normal sounds of the refrigerator humming and the ceiling fan creaking in the living room. That's when I heard the sliding glass door in the back of the house slowly grinding along its track. Not the quick swoosh when someone who knows the door opens it, but this long, drawn-out scraping sound like whoever was doing it wanted to be quiet, but didn't know about the spot where the track was bent from when I accidentally hit it with the lawnmower last spring. My whole body went rigid in bed, every muscle tensing up while my brain tried to process what I was hearing. The door continued its slow journey for what felt like 30 seconds but was probably only 5 or 6, and then came the soft thump of it hitting the rubber stopper at the end. Someone had just opened the back door completely, not just cracked it for air, but pushed it all the way open like they planned on coming inside. I laid there paralyzed, telling myself maybe it was just the wind, except there hadn't been even a breeze all day and that door was heavy enough that you really had to put some muscle into moving it. Then I heard footsteps on the kitchen tiles, not rushed or sneaky but casual, like someone walking into their own house after work. Each step was deliberate and unhurried, accompanied by this odd shuffling sound, like the person was dragging something or maybe wearing slippers that were too big. The footsteps paused, and I heard the refrigerator door open with that distinctive suction sound it made, the rubber seal releasing, and then the bright light from inside spilled out into the hallway, sending a long rectangle of yellow light that reached almost to my doorway. From where I was lying, if I lifted my head just slightly off the pillow, I could see a sliver of the kitchen, and what I saw made my heart pound so hard I was sure whoever was in there would hear it. There was a man standing in front of the open fridge, just standing there like he was contemplating what to eat for a midnight snack. He was wearing what looked like a mechanic's jumpsuit, the kind with a name patch on the chest, except it was filthy, covered in dark stains and what might have been dried mud or worse. His hair was long and greasy, hanging down past his shoulders in thick clumps, and even from my room I could smell him, this mixture of body odor, motor oil, and something sweet and rotten, like fruit that had been left in the sun too long. He wasn't rushing, wasn't grabbing things and running. He was examining items in the fridge, picking up my dad's beer bottles and setting them back down, opening Tupperware containers and sniffing the contents. The worst part was how normal he was trying to act, humming some tune I didn't recognize while he rummaged through our food, occasionally making these little satisfied grunts when he found something he liked. He pulled out a package of sliced turkey, peeled it open right there, and started eating the meat with his fingers, letting the juice drip onto the floor my dad had just had refinished last month. After each piece, he'd lick his fingers clean with these long, exaggerated motions, like he was savoring every drop. Then he moved on to a jar of pickles, twisted off the lid with a strength that made the muscles in his neck bulge, and drank the juice straight from the jar before fishing out pickles with his dirty fingers. My phone was charging on the desk across the room. Might as well have been a mile away for how impossible it seemed to reach it without making noise. Every few seconds, the man would shift his position, and I could see more of him. The way his jumpsuit was unzipped halfway down, revealing a stained white undershirt, the work boots that left black scuff marks on the clean floor, and what looked like a wrench sticking out of his back pocket. He grabbed a carton of orange juice, the expensive kind my dad bought from the farmer's market, and started chugging it directly from the container, some of it spilling down his chin and neck, creating wet patches on his already filthy clothes. When he finished, he didn't put it back. He just set it on the counter and let out this long, satisfied belch that echoed through the quiet house. Then he did something that made every hair on my body stand up. He stopped moving entirely and just stood there in the light of the open refrigerator, his head slightly tilted like he was listening for something. His breathing got heavier, these deep inhales through his nose like he was trying to smell something specific, and then he spoke, not loudly, but in this conversational tone like he was talking to someone standing right next to him. "Nice place," he said, his voice rough and phlegmy. "Real nice place you got here, kid." My entire body went cold because there was no way he could see me from where he was standing, but somehow he knew I was there, knew I was awake and watching him violate my home with his presence. He started walking then, not toward my room but into the living room, and I could hear him touching things. The distinctive squeak of the leather couch when he sat down, the jingle of my dad's keys on the coffee table being picked up and set back down, the TV remote clicking but the TV not turning on because I'd taken the batteries out earlier to put in my game controller. "Dead batteries," he muttered, and then laughed, this wet, choking sound that turned into a cough. He walked over to the mantel where my dad kept photos of our family, and I heard the frames being moved around, picked up, maybe examined in the dim light coming through the windows. "Pretty family," he said to no one, or maybe to me, knowing I could hear every word. "Real pretty. Shame about the divorce, though, yeah, real shame when families break apart like that." The fact that he knew about the divorce made my chest tighten with a different kind of fear. This wasn't random. He'd been watching us, knew things about our life that a stranger shouldn't know. I heard him walk down the hallway toward the bathroom, his boots heavy on the hardwood, and then the sound of him urinating with the door wide open, not even pretending to need privacy. The toilet didn't flush afterward. Instead, I heard the medicine cabinet open, bottles rattling as he pawed through them. "Sleeping pills," he read out loud, "anxiety medication, blood pressure meds, somebody's stressed in this house." Each word was like he was building a profile of my family, gathering intelligence from our private spaces, and there was nothing I could do but lie there, pretending to be asleep while this stranger mapped out our lives through our belongings. Then his footsteps started coming back down the hallway, slower this time, and they stopped right at my doorway. I could see his shadow blocking the dim light from the kitchen, this massive dark shape just standing there. I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly, even though my lungs wanted to hyperventilate, keeping my eyes nearly closed but still able to see through my lashes. He stood there for what must have been 2 full minutes just watching me, and I could hear his breathing, raspy and irregular, mixed with this weird clicking sound he was making with his tongue against his teeth. "You're good at playing dead, kid," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Real good. Your daddy taught you that, or did you learn it after he started leaving you alone in this big house?" He knew I was awake, had known the whole time, and was enjoying the game of me pretending otherwise. He took one step into my room, just one, and I could smell him even stronger now, that sick sweet stench mixed with something chemical, like paint thinner or cleaning fluid. "I could come in," he said, still in that conversational whisper. "Could come right in and sit on the edge of your bed, have a real talk about things. But that's not what tonight's about." He pulled something from his pocket, and I heard the distinctive sound of a Polaroid camera, that mechanical whir and click, followed by the photo sliding out. "Just wanted to remember this moment," he said, and then he turned and walked back down the hall, his footsteps unhurried, taking his time like he had all night to do whatever he wanted in our house. I listened as he went back to the kitchen, opened a few more cabinets, ran water in the sink for some reason, and then finally, I heard him walking toward the back door. But he didn't leave right away. He stood there at the open sliding door, and I could hear him breathing in the night air. "You should tell your daddy about the lock on this door," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the house. "That bent track makes it real easy to pop open from the outside if you know the trick. Been that way since spring, hasn't it? Since that lawnmower accident?" He knew about that too, had probably been watching even then, and the thought made me want to vomit. The door slid closed with that same slow grinding sound, and then I heard something that confused me, the click of it locking from the outside, which should have been impossible. I stayed frozen in that bed for another hour, maybe 2, until the sky started getting light outside and I could hear birds beginning their morning songs. Only then did I grab my phone and call 911, my voice shaking so bad the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself 3 times. The cops found the back door locked properly. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen except the food he'd eaten. They found boot prints in the backyard that led to and from the alley, and one officer mentioned that the lock mechanism had been tampered with months ago. Someone had installed a way to lock and unlock it from outside that would be almost impossible to notice unless you knew what to look for. They never found the guy, but I did find something tucked under my windshield wiper 2 days later when my dad was back home. A Polaroid photo of me lying in bed, eyes squeezed shut, pretending to sleep while a shadow loomed in my doorway. Last Saturday changed everything about how I feel in my own home. I'm 28, been living alone in this rental house in suburban Portland for about 2 years now, and up until that day, I'd never once felt unsafe here. It's a quiet neighborhood, mostly families and retired couples, the kind of place where people still wave when you pass them walking their dogs. I work from home doing graphic design, which means I'm here pretty much all day, every day. That morning started like any other. Coffee, emails, a client revision that needed to be done by Monday. The weather was gorgeous. One of those perfect spring days where you leave all the windows open and let the fresh air flow through. I remember specifically because I'd just finished cleaning the whole house and was feeling pretty good about life in general. Around 11:30, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a man in his 40s, maybe early 50s, wearing a navy polo shirt with some kind of logo I couldn't quite make out. He had this clipboard in one hand and a metal toolbox at his feet, the kind with multiple compartments that fold out like stairs. His hair was slicked back with too much gel, and he kept adjusting his collar like it was bothering him. When I opened the door but kept the chain on, he immediately launched into this rehearsed speech about annual pest inspections for the neighborhood. Said his name was Craig from Residential Defense Solutions, and that they'd been contracted by the property management company to check all the houses on my street. The way he kept trying to peek past me into the house while talking made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. I asked him for identification and any paperwork from my property management company. He fumbled with his clipboard, flipping through what I could now see were mostly blank pages, with a few random printed forms on top. He said he must have left the work order in the truck and offered to go get it, but then immediately tried a different angle, saying it would only take 15 minutes and that all the other neighbors had already let him in. The thing that really got me was his shoes. Pristine white sneakers without a single scuff or dirt mark. Weird for someone who'd supposedly been going in and out of houses all morning. Plus, my property management company always sends emails about any scheduled maintenance at least a week in advance, and I'd gotten nothing. When I told him I'd need to verify with them first, his whole demeanor shifted. The friendly salesman's smile stayed plastered on his face, but his jaw clenched and his grip on the clipboard turned his knuckles white. He stood there for an uncomfortable few seconds, just staring at me through the gap in the door. Then he asked if maybe my husband was home and could make the decision. When I said I lived alone, stupid I know, but it just came out automatically. His eyes lit up in this way that made my whole body tense up. He quickly covered it by nodding and saying he understood, that he'd come back another time when it was more convenient. But instead of leaving right away, he made this show of writing something on his clipboard, asking me to spell my last name twice and confirm my phone number, which I didn't give him. He even asked what time I usually get home from work, for scheduling purposes. I just kept repeating that he should coordinate through the property management company and started closing the door. He put his foot near the threshold, not quite blocking it but close enough to make me panic for a second, then pulled it back with a laugh, saying he didn't mean to be pushy. After he finally left, I watched through the living room window as he walked back to his vehicle, a white van with no company logos or phone numbers, just completely blank. He sat in the driver's seat for way too long, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and I could see him looking at my house, writing things down. Eventually he drove off, but only to park 3 houses down where he sat for another 10 minutes before leaving the street entirely. I immediately called my property management company, and they confirmed what I already knew. They hadn't scheduled any pest control services, and they'd never heard of Residential Defense Solutions. The woman on the phone seemed concerned, and said she'd send out a notice to all tenants warning them about the fake service calls. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A pushy salesman came to my door and made me uncomfortable? Technically, he hadn't done anything illegal. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on work at all. Every little sound made me jumpy. The mailman dropping off packages, a neighbor's dog barking, even the ice maker in my freezer kicking on. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to take my laptop to a coffee shop just to get out of the house for a while. When I came back around 7, everything looked normal. I checked all the locks twice, made dinner, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But something kept nagging at me, this weird feeling that things weren't exactly how I'd left them, though I couldn't point to anything specific. My trash can seemed like it had been moved slightly, and the garden hose was uncoiled a bit more than I remembered. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I even laughed at myself for walking around my own house like I was in some crime show, checking closets and behind shower curtains. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started drifting off, I'd hear something, or think I heard something, outside. Around 2 in the morning, there was definitely a noise by my bedroom window, like branches scraping against the siding, except the nearest tree is a good 10 feet away. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear over my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After about 20 minutes of silence, I finally got brave enough to peek through the blinds. Nothing there but my own backyard bathed in moonlight. I eventually fell asleep around 4, only to wake up at 8 feeling completely drained. Sunday morning sunlight was streaming in. Birds were chirping, and everything seemed so normal that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole threatening vibe from the day before. I made breakfast, did some laundry, even managed to finish that client revision I'd abandoned on Saturday. It wasn't until around noon, when I went outside to water my small vegetable garden, that I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, leading from my front porch around the side of the house. My stomach turned to ice as I followed them. They went straight to my bedroom window, where the dirt was all pressed down like someone had stood there for a while. The prints were deep, from someone heavy, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. Right under the window, there were 2 cigarette butts ground into the mulch, the brand with the gold band around the filter. I remembered seeing Craig holding that exact brand of cigarettes in his shirt pocket yesterday. But what really made me want to throw up was finding the small pile of wood shavings on the windowsill, like someone had been working at the lock with a knife or tool. The lock itself had fresh scratch marks all around it, bright silver gouges in the painted metal. I ran back inside and called 911 immediately. While waiting for the police, I noticed more things I'd missed before. The motion sensor light on that side of the house had been unscrewed just enough to disable it. There was a partial handprint on the glass of the window, like someone had pressed their palm against it while trying to see inside. The officer who showed up, a younger guy named Daniels, took it seriously right away. He photographed everything, bagged the cigarette butts, even called for another unit to canvass the neighborhood. Turns out I wasn't the only one. 2 other women on nearby streets had reported the same fake pest control guy in the past week, though I was the first where he'd come back. Officer Daniels had me walk through the entire interaction again, and when I mentioned the white van with no markings, he got on his radio immediately. They'd been tracking similar reports from 3 different neighborhoods, all targeting women living alone. The detective who came later, a woman named Harper, was even more thorough. She had me go through my daily routine, asked about any recent changes, whether I'd noticed anyone following me or any strange cars. That's when I remembered something that made everything click into place. About 2 weeks earlier, I'd posted on a local Facebook marketplace group selling some old furniture. Several people had come by to look at items, and I'd stupidly mentioned to one guy that I needed to sell stuff quickly because my roommate had moved out and I needed the extra space. He'd seemed normal enough, bought an old dresser, even had his teenage son with him to help load it, but now I wondered if that had been his son at all. Detective Harper showed me a photo array, and there he was, Craig, except his real name was Nathan Briggs, and he had 2 prior arrests for attempted burglary and 1 for stalking. They arrested him that same night at a motel about 20 miles away. The police found my address written on a napkin in his van, along with the addresses of 5 other women and notes about their schedules when they were home alone, details about their routines. He had a whole kit in the back, lockpicks, a glass cutting tool, duct tape, zip ties, and a camera with photos of my house from different angles, including ones of me through my kitchen window from earlier that week that I'd never known he was taking. Detective Harper told me he'd been watching for days, learning when I worked out, when I got groceries, when I turned my lights off at night. The Facebook furniture sale had just been how he initially identified me, but he'd done research after that. found my LinkedIn, my Instagram, pieced together that I worked from home and lived alone. They also found the polo shirt with a fake pest control logo he'd had printed at some local shop, along with 2 other shirts for different fake services. The trial was 6 months later, and I had to testify about that Saturday, about finding those footprints and cigarette butts and scratches on my window lock. He pled guilty to attempted burglary and stalking charges, got 4 years in state prison. I thought I'd feel safer after that, but I don't. I moved 2 months after it happened, broke my lease early, and paid the penalty because I couldn't sleep in that bedroom knowing he'd stood right outside, trying to get in while I was lying there in the dark. My new place is a 3rd-floor apartment with a doorman and security cameras everywhere. I still check twice when anyone comes to the door claiming to be maintenance or delivery. I Google every service company before letting them in. And I never, ever tell anyone I live alone anymore. The detective said I did everything right, that calling the property management company and not letting him in probably saved my life. But sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, thinking I hear something at the window, even though I'm 3 stories up now and I know he's locked up until 2028. Most people assume nothing bad happens in quiet suburban neighborhoods, especially during spring break, when everyone's either traveling or sleeping in until noon. I was 17, a junior at Riverside High, and my parents had driven up to visit my older brother at college for the weekend, leaving me alone in our 2-story colonial house on Willow Court. I'd stayed behind because I had a shift at the ice cream shop on Saturday, and honestly just wanted some time to myself, binge-watching shows and eating junk food, without anyone judging me. The neighborhood was one of those places where kids still rode bikes in the street, and people actually knew each other's names, where the biggest drama was usually someone's lawn getting too tall or a package thief making rounds during the holidays. I'd lived there my whole life, knew every family on our block, could tell you which house had the mean German shepherd and which one gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween. The knock came around 2 in the afternoon, right when I was deep into a true crime documentary about home invasions, which in hindsight feels almost too ironic. It was 3 firm raps, not the familiar rhythm of our neighbor Mrs. Coleman, who always did this little melodic pattern, or the aggressive pounding of delivery drivers who were behind schedule. I paused the show, waited a few seconds to see if they'd just leave whatever package and go, but then came 3 more knocks, slower this time, more deliberate. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men standing on our porch, both wearing jeans and plain t-shirts. One navy blue, one faded gray, nothing particularly threatening about their appearance except maybe how they stood perfectly still, not shifting their weight or checking their phones like most people do when waiting at a door. The younger one had buzzed hair and looked maybe 30, with a narrow face and eyes that were this really pale green, almost like sea glass, while the older one, probably mid-40s, had dark hair that was just starting to gray at the temples and thick eyebrows that met in the middle when he squinted against the afternoon sun. I opened the door but kept the chain on, which gave me maybe 3 inches of space to talk through, and immediately the younger one stepped forward, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke and something else, maybe motor oil or that harsh soap mechanics use. "Hey there, sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice had this weird flatness to it, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't quite believe in. "We're looking for our dog, a beagle mix named Copper. About 40 pounds, brown and white patches. He slipped out of his collar about an hour ago and we tracked him to this street." The older man stayed back on the porch steps, but he was scanning our front yard, then the windows of our house, his gaze moving systematically from left to right like he was cataloging every detail, every possible entry point. I told them I hadn't seen any dogs, offered to keep an eye out, gave them the standard polite response you give to strangers who show up at your door with a reasonable request. But the younger one kept talking, asking if maybe the dog could have gotten into our backyard, if we had any gaps in our fence, if I was home alone or if my parents might have seen something. The questions made my chest tight in that instinctive way your body warns you before your brain catches up, and I found myself gripping the door handle hard enough that my knuckles ached. "Just me here, but I've been inside all day," I lied, even though my mom's car was visible in the driveway and obviously someone had been home to answer the door. But the younger man just nodded slowly, like he was filing that information away for later. The older one finally spoke up, his voice deeper, rougher, with this slight accent I couldn't place, maybe somewhere from Eastern Europe. "You have a beautiful home, very well maintained. Your parents must work very hard." It wasn't a question, and the way he said it, emphasizing the word parents while staring directly at me through those 3 inches of door gap, made every alarm bell in my head start screaming. I told them good luck finding copper, practically slammed the door shut, twisted the deadbolt, and watched through the peephole as they stood there for another solid 30 seconds before the younger one said something to the older one that made them both laugh. This quiet, shared moment that felt somehow worse than if they'd been angry about my abruptness. I watched them walk down our driveway, neither of them looking back, and they got into this white van that had no windows in the back, no company logo, nothing but dirt caked on the license plate, making it impossible to read. They drove off slowly, maybe 15 miles per hour, and turned left at the stop sign, which would take them out of the neighborhood if they kept going straight. But something in my gut told me they weren't leaving. Not really. I called my mom immediately, told her about the weird guys looking for their dog, and she did that parent thing where she's trying not to sound worried while simultaneously asking me 50 questions about what they looked like, what they wanted, if I'd locked all the doors. She offered to come home right away, but it was a 3-hour drive, and honestly, in the daylight with the doors locked and our neighbor Mr. Hoffman mowing his lawn next door, I felt silly for being so paranoid. Still, I went through the house checking every window lock, made sure the sliding door to the back patio had the wooden rod in the track, even pushed a chair under the doorknob of the door that led from our garage to the kitchen, which I'd seen someone do in a movie once. For the next 2 hours, I tried to go back to normal, made myself a sandwich, switched from true crime to some mindless reality show about people buying houses in tropical places, texted with my friend Amber about her date the night before. Every few minutes, though, I'd find myself walking to the front window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out at the street, expecting to see that white van creeping past. But there was nothing except the usual Saturday afternoon quiet, someone walking their actual dog, a few kids on scooters. Around 4:30, the sun was starting to slant through the trees, creating these long shadows across our front yard, and I was in the kitchen making popcorn when I heard a car door slam. Not unusual, except it sounded close, like right in front of our house close. I crept to the dining room window, which gave me a view of the driveway, and my whole body went rigid when I saw them. The same 2 men from earlier, standing at the end of our driveway where it met the sidewalk, just standing there, not moving, not talking, both of them facing our house with their arms hanging loose at their sides. They stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes, though it felt like hours, and I stayed frozen at the dining room window, barely breathing, my phone gripped so tight in my hand that the edges dug into my palm. The younger one had his head tilted slightly to one side like he was listening for something, while the older one's lips were moving just barely, maybe counting, maybe rehearsing something. I couldn't tell from that distance. Then, without any warning or signal that I could see, they both started walking up our driveway in perfect synchronization, same pace, same stride length, like they'd practiced this approach, and I scrambled backwards, knocking into a dining room chair that scraped against the hardwood floor, loud enough that I was sure they heard it. But they didn't knock this time, didn't ring the doorbell. They just stood on our front porch, and through the thin curtains on the door's side windows, I could see their silhouettes, distorted and dark, one standing directly in front of the door while the other seemed to be examining the door frame, running his fingers along the edges, where the lock met the wood. My phone was already dialing 911 when the older one pressed his face against the small window beside the door, cupping his hands around his eyes to see inside better. And I swear he was smiling. Not a normal smile, but this slow, deliberate stretching of his lips that showed too many teeth. The operator answered just as the doorknob rattled. A gentle test at first, then harder, more insistent, and I whispered that 2 men were trying to break into my house, gave her our address in a voice that came out high and shaky like a little kid's. She told me officers were on the way, to stay on the line, to get somewhere safe, and I was backing toward the stairs, thinking I could lock myself in my parents' bedroom, which had a phone and a lock and a window that opened onto the garage roof if I needed to run. The rattling stopped suddenly, and through the curtains I saw them step back from the door, the younger one pulling something from his pocket that caught the late afternoon light, metal and thin, probably a lockpick or maybe a Slim Jim, the kind of tools that would make quick work of our standard suburban locks. But then Mr. Hoffman's voice cut through everything, loud and gruff the way it got when he'd been drinking beer in his garage all afternoon. "Everything all right over there, gentlemen?" I peeked through the dining room window again and saw him standing at the property line between our houses, holding a rake but really just holding it like you might hold a baseball bat. And even though he was in his 60s with a bad knee from his construction days, he had that stance that said he'd seen enough bar fights to know how to end one. The 2 men turned toward him in that same synchronized way that made my skin prickle, and the younger one raised his hand in this casual wave, called out something about looking for their lost dog again, asking if he'd seen a beagle around. But Mr. Hoffman just stood there, not buying it for a second. "Funny thing," he said, taking a few steps closer. "I've been out here for 3 hours doing yard work, haven't seen a single dog that wasn't on a leash, and you boys have been sitting in that van down the street for the last hour before you came knocking." The older man started to say something, but we all heard the sirens at the same time, growing louder, definitely heading our way, and without a word, both men walked quickly, but not quite running back to their van, Mr. Hoffman following them with his eyes until they drove off, this time much faster, tires actually squealing a little as they took the corner. The police arrived maybe 90 seconds after the van disappeared. 2 officers who looked barely older than my brother, and they took everything seriously even though the men were already gone. They walked through the yard, checked for any attempted entry points, found some scratches on the door lock that looked fresh, took photos of everything including the boot prints on our porch that had this distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. Mr. Hoffman gave his statement, told them about the van's license plate, which he'd actually managed to catch most of despite the dirt. Turns out he'd been suspicious enough to write it down after he saw them lingering, and one of the officers ran it right there in his cruiser. The plates came back as reported stolen from a vehicle 2 towns over, which made everyone's expression change from routine response to something much more serious. And suddenly they were calling for additional units to canvass the neighborhood, asking if I had somewhere else to stay for the night, strongly suggesting I not remain in the house alone. My parents drove home like bats out of hell, made it in just over 2 hours, my dad talking to me on speakerphone the whole time while my mom drove, and I spent those hours at Mr. Hoffman's house, sitting in his living room that smelled like cigarettes and Old Spice, while his wife Dorothy made me eat 3 different kinds of cookies and kept patting my shoulder. The police found the van abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 6 miles away, completely wiped clean of prints. Nothing inside except some rope, zip ties, and a roll of duct tape in the back that made everyone real quiet when the detective mentioned it on the phone. They never found the men, though the detective, a woman named Brennan with kind eyes and a scar through her left eyebrow, told us they matched the description of 2 suspects wanted for questioning in 3 home invasion cases in the neighboring county, cases where they'd used the same lost dog story to scope out houses. In 2 of those cases, they'd come back later when they thought the houses were empty, except one time a family's college-aged daughter had been homesick from work, and what happened to her was bad enough that Detective Brennan wouldn't give us details, just said we'd been incredibly fortunate that Mr. Hoffman had been outside, that I'd called 911 when I did. We installed a security system the next week, cameras and motion sensors and panic buttons in every room. The whole expensive package that my parents would have called overkill a month earlier. I finished out my junior year sleeping with my door locked and a baseball bat beside my bed, jumping at every unexpected knock. every van that drove too slowly past our house. The strange thing is, about 8 months later, I was at the mall 2 towns over with friends when I saw him. The younger one with the pale green eyes, working at a phone repair kiosk, wearing a polo shirt with a name tag that said Kevin, helping some elderly woman with her screen protector like he was just another normal person with a normal job. He saw me at the exact moment I saw him, and for maybe 3 seconds we just stared at each other across the food court, my friends chattering about prom dresses while every cell in my body screamed at me to run. He smiled then. That same slow, deliberate expression I'd seen through my door window, gave me this little mock salute with 2 fingers, and went right back to helping his customer like nothing had happened. I never told anyone about seeing him. Not my parents, not the police, because what would I say? That one of the men who'd tried to break into our house was just out there living his life, fixing phones at the Westfield Mall, probably still looking for lost dogs that didn't exist, still standing in people's driveways at dusk, waiting for the right moment that, thankfully, for me, never came. I grew up in a pretty average townhouse, 2 floors plus a small crawl space attic no one ever used. Back then it was just me and my mom, since my dad worked out of state for weeks at a time. Most afternoons after school I'd be home alone until she finished her shift at the diner. I actually liked the quiet. I'd usually grab some cereal, put on whatever was on TV, and just enjoy not having anyone around. That day was no different at first. I had thrown my backpack down by the stairs, fixed myself a snack, and was sitting on the couch when I caught a faint sound above me. It wasn't the house settling. It was rhythmic, like someone shifting their weight. At first I tried brushing it off. Old houses creak, right? But this place wasn't that old, and I knew the sounds it normally made. This one was heavier, like a slow drag or someone scooting. I muted the TV and held my breath, straining to catch it again. There it was, directly above the living room ceiling where the crawl space stretched across the top floor. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall. It was barely past 4 p.m., too early for my mom to be home. The thought of being alone in the house suddenly didn't feel so comforting. I grabbed a broom from the corner and tapped the ceiling, half expecting silence. Instead, the sound stopped for a moment. Then something answered back. 3 short thumps. Deliberate. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I whispered "no way" to myself, trying to convince my brain I hadn't just been answered. I thought maybe a raccoon had gotten up there, but raccoons don't knock in patterns. I stood frozen in the living room, gripping that broom like it would actually help me if someone dropped down through the attic hatch. After what felt like forever, I worked up the nerve to creep upstairs. Every step felt impossibly loud against the carpet, like I was broadcasting that I was coming. The crawl space entrance was at the end of the hallway ceiling, with a little pull cord dangling. That cord had always annoyed me when I was younger. It swung slightly when the air conditioning kicked on, but at that moment it looked like a trigger I did not want to touch. I stood under it, broom still in my hand, staring up at the thin rectangle in the ceiling. The silence was unbearable. Then, as if to confirm my worst thought, I heard what sounded unmistakably like fabric rustling just above me. I backed away from the hatch and went into my room, shutting the door quietly like that thin layer of wood would do anything. I tried calling my mom, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I remember pacing in circles, considering whether I should just run outside and wait on the curb, but a part of me needed to know. The sound of fabric wasn't random. It was steady, like someone adjusting themselves in a sleeping bag. I kept replaying the knocks in my head. Whoever was up there knew I was in the house, and that thought made the walls feel like they were closing in. After about 10 minutes of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to grab the step ladder from the laundry closet. Every step as I dragged it down the hallway felt heavier than it should have. I positioned it under the hatch, the broom clenched so tight my knuckles were white. I told myself I'd just push the door open quickly, shine the flashlight on my phone, and confirm that it was an animal or nothing at all. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear it echoing in my ears. When I finally pulled the cord, The hatch creaked open just an inch, and a wave of hot, stale air rolled down over me. The crawl space smelled faintly of sweat and something sour, not like insulation or dust. I lifted the door further and aimed the light up. At first, I only caught a glimpse of wood beams and cluttered insulation, but then my eyes locked on a plastic wrapper lying on top of the insulation. Next to it was a crumpled water bottle, lying exactly where no one should have been. That's when I heard it, shifting again, farther back in the darkness. Someone was lying flat, deeper in. I didn't stick around to see more. I slammed the hatch shut so hard the ladder wobbled and I bolted downstairs. My phone was already in my hand as I dialed 911. I remember how hard it was to keep my voice steady, trying to explain to the dispatcher that there was someone living above my room. They told me to stay outside and wait for officers. Standing barefoot in the driveway with my backpack still inside, I kept staring at the second-floor window, half expecting a face to appear. Those 15 minutes waiting for the squad car felt like hours, every sound from the neighborhood making me flinch. 2 officers finally pulled up, and I nearly ran to meet them. I remember how surreal it felt to explain everything again on the curb while pointing at the attic window. They didn't look convinced at first, until I told them about the smell, the wrappers, and the deliberate knocks. One officer went upstairs with his flashlight while the other stayed with me, and kept asking if I was sure no relatives had been staying there. I shook my head so hard it almost hurt. Then came a shout from above. "We've got something." They didn't find a person at that moment, but what they brought down still makes me uneasy to think about. A rolled-up sleeping bag, flattened from use, and a small pile of granola bar wrappers with water bottles tucked behind the insulation. The officer explained in that calm, professional tone that someone had been living up there for a while, sneaking in and out without us noticing. No forced entry anywhere in the house, no broken locks. Whoever it was had either been hiding for weeks or knew exactly when to come and go. Hearing that felt worse than if they had caught someone red-handed. That night, my mom and I barely slept. Every time the house shifted, we jumped. She called a locksmith first thing the next morning and had every lock replaced, even the windows. We also installed a padlock on the crawl space hatch itself. For weeks, I avoided walking down the hallway at night because that pull cord felt like it was taunting me. The police never figured out who it was. They dusted the hatch for prints, but nothing useful came up. Apparently, cases like this happen more often than people think, which is not the reassurance I wanted. To this day, whenever I hear any sound above me, I can't help but picture someone pressed flat against the beams, waiting. I'll never forget the deliberate rhythm of those knocks, like the stranger wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Even though they're long gone, the thought of how close they were still makes my chest tighten. I guess the scariest part is realizing that sometimes the most dangerous people don't break into your home. They're already inside, quietly waiting for you to notice. I used to spend a lot of time at a small park a couple of blocks from my house. Back then I was 12, and that park felt like the center of my world. Basketball hoops with bent rims, a cracked swing set, and the old water fountain that barely worked but somehow always drew kids around it. That day had been normal. I shot hoops until the sun dipped low, and then started heading home, sneakers scuffing against the uneven sidewalk. Nothing about it stood out at first, but by the time I passed the corner store, I noticed a car creeping along the street, moving slower than traffic ever should on that block. It wasn't unusual to see cars cut through the neighborhood, but this one didn't just pass. It circled. I saw the same faded blue sedan loop around, headlights dim, as if the driver didn't want to draw attention. I remember the driver's hand on the wheel, long fingers drumming lightly, and the way the car kept a steady crawl, always just far enough back that I couldn't make out his face clearly. My chest tightened with each turn I took, realizing he was taking them too. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. By the time I turned onto my street, the air felt heavy. The houses all looked the same, tidy lawns with trimmed hedges, but it was like the whole block had gone silent, watching me. The sedan rolled past my driveway once, and for a second I thought it would keep going. But when I shut the front door behind me and peeked through the blinds, there it was again, sliding slowly back down the street, idling at the stop sign as if it had nowhere else to be. I called out for my mom, then remembered she was still at work. My dad was on a night shift and my older brother was at a friend's house. I was alone. Hours crawled by after that. I left the TV on for background noise, tried distracting myself with video games, but every few minutes I checked the blinds. The car was gone once, then back again, parked across the street with its engine running. The low hum drifted through the glass when everything inside was quiet, a sound that didn't belong in the middle of the night on that block. I didn't know what scared me more, the idea that the driver was just sitting there staring at my house, or that he might get out. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that maybe the guy was waiting for someone who lived nearby. But then I saw the glow of a cigarette tip through the windshield. He wasn't just sitting there, he was awake, active, watching. The blinds in our living room were thin, and I felt like every time I moved he could see exactly where I was. I turned off most of the lights, hoping the house would look empty, but that only made the hum of the engine stand out louder against the silence. It was like the house itself was holding its breath with me. Around 9, the phone rang. For a second I thought about picking it up, but fear kicked in. What if it was him? That didn't make sense, but in that moment my brain spun with every possible scenario. When the answering machine clicked, I heard my brother's voice leaving a quick message about staying over one more night. I remember whispering no out loud, as if that could change it. My brother was my safety net, and without him there, the walls of the house felt thinner than ever. I tried the old trick of making it seem like someone else was home, clattering dishes in the sink, stomping around like I was talking to someone down the hall. But when I checked the window again, the car hadn't moved an inch. The orange glow of the cigarette had vanished, but the engine was still running, a constant low growl that kept vibrating through the night. The longer it stayed, the more unreal it felt. Why my house? Why me? At one point, I thought I saw the driver's side door shift, like it cracked open just a few inches. My throat went dry. I grabbed the phone, ready to call 911, but my fingers hovered over the buttons, frozen by the thought of explaining it and having the dispatcher think I was just a kid overreacting. I remember pacing in the hallway, the glow of the television flickering faintly from the living room, and every shadow in that house suddenly felt alive. I finally decided to call my mom at work. When she picked up, I tried to sound calm, but the words came out shaky as I told her there was a car outside that wouldn't leave. She didn't brush it off, which surprised me. Instead, she told me to lock every door, stay away from the windows, and that she was calling the police right away. Hearing her say that made it real. This wasn't just in my head. Someone was truly watching the house. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The sedan jerked forward, like the driver hadn't expected anyone to show up, and for a moment I thought he would take off. But the cruiser swung around fast, blocking the exit at the end of the block. I couldn't see what happened after that, just the silhouettes of two officers approaching the car, one with a flashlight cutting through the dark interior. I pressed my forehead against the wall by the window, straining to hear. But the engine finally cut off, leaving the block eerily quiet. An officer came to the door not long after. He asked me a few questions. If I had ever seen the man before, if he'd said anything, if he tried to approach me earlier. I told him about the circling, about the cigarette, about how he sat there for hours without moving. The officer nodded like he'd heard similar stories before, but he didn't share much else. Just said the guy had a reason to be looked into, and that I shouldn't worry because he wouldn't be coming back that night. His tone was steady, but he avoided details, which almost made it worse. I never learned what they found or why he was really there. When my mom finally came home, she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, and we sat up together until dawn, the TV flickering quietly in the background. The street outside looked normal again by morning, like nothing had happened, but I couldn't unhear that low hum of the engine or unsee that glowing ember in the car across the street. To this day, I never got an explanation. The sedan never came back, and maybe that should be enough. But every time I walk past that park, I still glance around, half expecting to see a car creeping slowly behind me again. The house felt heavier than usual that evening, the kind of quiet that makes you notice the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the walls settling. I was 16, home alone because my mom was working a double shift at the hospital and my younger brother was at a friend's house. I'd been sprawled on the couch half watching some old sitcom rerun when the knocking started. At first it sounded ordinary, like a neighbor dropping by, but the rhythm didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, almost rehearsed. When I got up and peeked through the peephole, there was a man standing on the porch. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a gray jacket zipped up to his chin and a baseball cap pulled low. He knocked again and called out, saying he was from the utility company. His voice carried a strange calmness, like he'd practiced this line before. But what immediately struck me was what he didn't have. No badge, no reflective vest, not even a clipboard. Just empty hands shoved into his pockets like he wasn't there for work at all. I asked through the door which company he said he was with. His answer was quick, like he'd been waiting for that question, but it still didn't sound right. He avoided giving a clear name, mumbling something about routine checks in the neighborhood. When I asked for ID, he didn't hold anything up, just said, "Don't worry, it's just a formality." My gut tightened. The longer I looked at him, the more wrong it seemed. His shoes were dirty, like he'd been walking through mud, and there was a small tear on the sleeve of his jacket that looked burned. I didn't open the door. Instead, I said my mom wasn't home and that I couldn't help him. He stood there silently for a few seconds, then knocked one more time, lighter this time, before walking away down the sidewalk. I stayed by the door until I couldn't hear his steps anymore. The house felt even quieter after that, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence where you're waiting for something else to happen, where every shadow feels like it's holding its breath. After he left, I tried to shake it off. I went back to the couch, turned the volume up on the TV, and even texted my mom to let her know what happened. She told me to keep the doors locked and not answer anyone until she got home. That should have been enough to settle me, but I couldn't relax. Every time headlights passed the house, I caught myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that gray jacket standing there again. Even the sound of branches scraping against the siding made me flinch. Around midnight, I decided to check the security cameras we had set up outside. My stepdad installed them after a string of car break-ins in the neighborhood, and usually they just captured raccoons or stray cats. I scrolled through the earlier footage and saw him again. The same man, walking past our porch after I'd closed the blinds. He lingered at the edge of the yard for nearly 2 minutes, pacing back and forth before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't notice it at the time, but on the footage he kept glancing back at the house as if waiting for the lights to go out. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed in the living room with the lights on. At around 2 in the morning, I heard faint rattling noises, like metal jingling. I muted the TV and listened closely. It was coming from the back of the house, near the sliding glass door. I pulled the camera feed back up on my phone and nearly dropped it when I saw him again. He wasn't knocking this time. He was walking slowly along the side of the house, tugging at every single door handle he came across. The garage, the laundry room, even the shed out back. His head moved side to side like he was checking for movement inside. The worst part was the way he carried himself. There was no rush, no panic, like he had all the time in the world. He even leaned close to the kitchen window at one point, pressing his forehead against the glass as if he was trying to see inside. I ducked down behind the couch, heart thudding, afraid he might spot me if I moved too quickly. Every sound in the house, pipes, air vents, the clicking of the thermostat, felt amplified, like any one of them could give me away. I stayed crouched behind the couch, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles hurt. I debated calling the police, but worried that by the time they arrived, he might already be gone. Still, after he jiggled the handle to the mudroom door twice, I dialed 911. I whispered into the phone, giving the dispatcher my address and telling her someone was actively trying to break in. She told me to stay on the line and keep hidden until officers arrived, I could hear her calm voice, but all I could focus on was the faint scrape of the man's shoes outside, dragging across the patio. The dispatcher told me to describe him, so I peeked at the camera feed again. He had pulled his cap off now, revealing short, uneven hair, like it had been shaved in patches. His face wasn't what I expected. It wasn't angry, it wasn't frantic. It was blank, almost bored, like he was testing each entry point just to see which one would give first. Watching him pull at the handle of the basement door while standing in that eerie, casual way made me feel trapped in a nightmare that had no clear script. Red and blue lights eventually lit up the street outside, flashing across the living room walls like salvation. The man stepped back from the house as if he'd finally been caught mid-thought. He didn't run. He just walked down the side yard and slipped into the shadows before the officers even reached the driveway. By the time they checked the property, he was gone. They reviewed the footage with me, took notes, and promised to patrol the area through the night. Still, none of that erased the fact that he had walked around my house for nearly an hour, testing every possible way in. I never saw him again, but for weeks after, I barely slept. Every knock at the door made me tense. My stepdad added extra locks, reinforced the sliding door, and even installed motion lights in the yard. Sometimes I still check the cameras late at night, half expecting that gray jacket to appear again at the edge of the frame. To this day, no one knows who he was or why he singled out our house, but the thought that he might still be out there, patient, waiting, makes the quietest nights feel the loudest. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The cruise was supposed to be our fresh start. Just me and my 6-year-old son Noah, sailing away from the messy divorce that had consumed the last 18 months of our lives. I'd saved for this trip for almost 2 years, picking up extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, squirreling away every overtime dollar into a jar labeled New Beginnings. We boarded the ship in Miami on a humid Saturday morning in July 2018, and I remember thinking how massive the vessel looked from the dock. 12 decks of gleaming white metal and glass, with pools and restaurants and enough activities to keep Noah entertained for our 7-day Caribbean adventure. The other passengers seemed like typical cruise folks, families with kids, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, honeymooners taking selfies against the railings. Noah was practically vibrating with excitement, clutching his little backpack with his Nintendo DS, and asking me every 5 minutes when we could go to the water slides. The first day was perfect, exactly what I'd imagined when I booked this trip. We explored the ship from top to bottom, Noah's eyes going wide at the rock-climbing wall, the mini golf course, the ice cream parlor that stayed open until midnight. We ate dinner at the buffet where he piled his plate high with mac and cheese and chocolate cake. And I didn't even scold him about vegetables because we were on vacation, damn it. And he deserved to just be a kid after everything he'd witnessed during the divorce proceedings. That night, after tucking him into the bottom bunk in our tiny interior cabin, I stood in our bathroom the size of a closet and looked at myself in the mirror. My brown hair was already getting lighter from just one day in the sun, and for the first time in forever, the bags under my eyes didn't look quite so dark. I actually felt hopeful. The ship's gentle rocking was soothing, and the hum of the engines created white noise that made Noah sleep deeper than he had in months. I fell asleep thinking about the snorkeling excursion we'd booked for Grand Cayman, imagining Noah's face when he saw tropical fish for the first time. Everything shifted on day 2. It started with something small, an announcement over the ship's PA system during breakfast. Attention passengers, would young Sofia Martinez please report to guest services on deck 4? Sofia Martinez to guest services. Noah was busy drowning his pancakes in syrup while I sipped my coffee, watching the ocean through the dining room's massive windows. 10 minutes later, Another announcement. Christopher Johnson, please report to guest services. Christopher Johnson, 8 years old, wearing a blue Captain America shirt. That detail stuck with me. Why would they describe what the kid was wearing? I figured maybe the child was lost and they were helping the parents locate them. But then 20 minutes passed and another name was called. Isabella Thompson, 7 years old, last seen near the splash zone on deck 11. The woman at the table next to us, traveling with her 3 kids, caught my eye and shrugged. "Busy morning for lost kids," she said with a nervous laugh. I nodded, but something was gnawing at me. In my 12 years working pediatric nursing, I'd developed a sixth sense for when things weren't right with children. By lunchtime, they'd called 6 more names, always children between ages 5 and 9, always with those specific details, what they were wearing, where they were last seen. But here's what made my pulse quicken. I never saw any of these kids being reunited with their families. Not once did I witness a relieved parent hugging their lost child near guest services. I started paying attention, really watching. The pool deck was packed with families, kids running around with soft-serve cones dripping down their arms, parents lounging on deck chairs slathered in sunscreen. But I began noticing other things too. There were staff members who didn't quite fit, men in cruise uniforms who weren't serving drinks or cleaning or leading activities. They were just watching. One guy in particular, tall and thin with acne scars across his cheeks, kept walking the same route around the main pool, his eyes scanning the crowd. He wore a legitimate crew badge, but something about how he moved set off every alarm in my head. When Noah asked if he could go down the water slide alone, it was just a short walk from where I was sitting. I heard myself saying no, even though normally I would have let him. "But Mom, I'm not a baby," he whined. I pulled him closer and told him we'd go together in a few minutes. That afternoon, we were at the kids' club entrance on deck 7. Noah wanted to join the treasure hunt activity, and I figured it would be safe. It was a supervised program in an enclosed space with security check-in. While I was filling out the permission form, a man approached us. He was maybe 40, clean-shaven, wearing the cruise line's bright yellow kids' club staff shirt with a name tag that read Kevin. But his shirt was too new, still had the fold creases from the package, and his name tag was slightly crooked. "Hey there, buddy," he said to Noah, completely ignoring me at first. "You here for the treasure hunt? Actually, we moved it to the arcade on deck 12. Way cooler prizes up there. Want me to take you?" Noah's face lit up. He'd been begging to go to the arcade since we boarded. He took a step toward the man, and that's when my body reacted before my brain. I grabbed Noah's shoulder, probably harder than necessary. "We'll go together," I said, my voice coming out sharp. The man's friendly expression flickered for just a second, a flash of irritation, maybe anger, before the smile returned. "Oh, parents aren't allowed in this special event. Insurance reasons, but I promise he'll have a blast." The real kids' club supervisor, a young woman with a Brazilian accent, looked up from her desk. "Kevin? I don't know any Kevin, and the treasure hunt is right here, ma'am, in our main room." The man didn't run. That's what chilled me the most. He just walked away, casually, like nothing had happened. The supervisor called security, but by the time they arrived, he'd vanished into the maze of corridors and decks. Security took my statement, said they'd look into it, but their tone suggested this was just another paranoid parent overreacting. Noah was upset that we left without doing the treasure hunt, but I couldn't get my heart rate back to normal. I kept replaying the moment. How quickly Noah had been ready to go with this stranger. How the man knew exactly what would appeal to my son. We went back to our cabin, and I locked the door, putting the chain on, even though I knew it was probably useless. I let Noah play his DS while I sat on my bunk, trying to process what had almost happened. The announcements continued over the PA system. "Madison Walker, 9 years old. Please report to guest services." Every time I held Noah a little tighter. I started a list in my phone, writing down every name they called, the times, the descriptions. By dinner time, I had 14 names. 14 children whose names echoed through the ship's speakers, but who never seemed to materialize anywhere. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the ship, every footstep in the hallway outside made me sit up in the dark. Noah was out cold, but I kept checking on him, making sure he was still there in his bunk. Around 3 a.m. I heard voices in the corridor, hushed but urgent. I pressed my ear against the door and caught fragments. Cozumel tomorrow, easier at the port, the Mexican contact. Then footsteps moving away. I wanted to open the door, see who it was, but I couldn't risk leaving Noah alone, not even for a second. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor between his bunk and the door, my phone in one hand and the cabin phone in the other, ready to call security at the slightest sound. The next morning I was exhausted but wired on adrenaline. At breakfast I started talking to other parents, casually at first. "Hey, did you hear all those announcements yesterday? So many lost kids." Most hadn't really noticed. They were on vacation, drinks flowing, kids in various programs. But one mother, a pediatrician from Dallas named Jennifer, had noticed. She pulled me aside near the omelet station. My daughter's friend from the teen club said she saw security footage being reviewed yesterday. 3 kids who were called over the PA were seen leaving the ship at Nassau Port with adults who weren't their parents. The staff told her it was a custody dispute thing, but she glanced around nervously. Those kids' families never reported them missing. I asked at guest services. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. These weren't just announcements. They were shopping lists. Someone was using the PA system to mark targets, maybe to signal accomplices. The more I thought about it, the more it made horrible sense. International waters meant murky jurisdiction, ports in developing countries where documentation might be lax, a ship with thousands of passengers where kids naturally wandered off from parents. It was a perfect hunting ground. Jennifer and I exchanged numbers, promised to watch each other's kids, but I knew that wasn't enough. We were heading to Cozumel that day. The words I'd heard in the hallway suddenly taking on new meaning. I made a decision. We weren't leaving the cabin. I told Noah I wasn't feeling well, and miracle of miracles, he didn't argue much. Maybe he sensed my fear. We stayed locked in that tiny room, eating room service, watching movies on my laptop. But the announcements continued. Timothy Brooks, 6 years old, blue swimsuit, last seen near the mini golf course. Each name felt like a countdown to something terrible. The breaking point came on day 4. We'd stayed holed up through the Cozumel port day, but Noah was getting restless, crying about missing everything fun. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take him to the breakfast buffet early when it would be less crowded. We were there at 6:30 a.m., the dining room mostly empty except for a few elderly early risers. Noah was eating cereal when I noticed him, the acne-scarred man from the pool deck, now wearing a server's uniform, standing by the juice station but not actually working. He was watching us. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled and started walking toward our table. I stood up so fast I knocked over my coffee cup. "Noah, we're leaving. Now." But when I turned, another man was behind us, younger, muscular, wearing a maintenance uniform. "Your son dropped this," he said, holding out a toy that wasn't Noah's. It was a distraction technique. I knew it instantly. The scarred man was now only 3 tables away. I grabbed Noah's hand and basically dragged him toward the nearest exit, but a third man appeared in the doorway. The fake Kevin from the kids' club. They were coordinating, boxing us in. That's when I did something I'm not proud of. I screamed. Not a help me scream, but a completely unhinged, "My child is having a seizure," scream that made everyone in the dining room turn. Noah looked at me in shock, but I pushed him to the floor and held his head, shouting for people to call medical. The elderly passengers rushed over, creating a crowd, and in the chaos, the 3 men melted away. They couldn't grab us with 20 witnesses surrounding us. Ship medical arrived with a wheelchair, and I kept up the act, saying Noah had childhood epilepsy, that I was a nurse, that we needed to get to the medical center immediately. Once we were in the medical bay with actual security present, I broke down and told them everything. The doctor, an older British woman named Dr. Whitmore, listened to my story while checking Noah over. She exchanged looks with the security chief, then quietly said, "You're not the first parent to report this. We've had 3 families leave the cruise early at previous ports after similar incidents." She pulled up something on her computer, then turned the screen away from us. "I'm going to recommend immediate disembarkation for medical reasons. There's a flight from Cozumel to Miami this afternoon. Security will escort you to pack and get off the ship." Her eyes were deadly serious. "Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Just pack and go." 2 security officers walked us to our cabin. Real security. With radios and serious expressions, not like the dismissive ones from before. While I threw our belongings into suitcases, one of them stood inside our room while the other guarded the hallway. Noah kept asking what was happening, why we were leaving, and I had to lie. "Mommy's really sick, baby. We need to go home." My hands shook as I zipped up the bags, remembering all those children's names called over the speakers. How many had actually made it home? The security officers took us down a service elevator I didn't even know existed, through corridors that passengers never see. Bare metal walls, exposed pipes, the underbelly of the floating city. We emerged at a crew exit on Deck 2, where a van was already waiting. The younger security officer, a Filipino man who'd been silent the whole time, suddenly grabbed my arm as we were about to get in the van. "Ma'am," he whispered, "delete any photos from the ship. Don't post about this online. These people, they have connections everywhere. Just go home and forget this cruise happened." His fear was so genuine it made my knees weak. During the ride to the airport, I held Noah so tight he complained he couldn't breathe. But I couldn't let go. I kept thinking about that fake Kevin, how he'd known exactly what my son wanted, how prepared they all were. We made it home to Ohio that night. The cruise line refunded our entire trip without me even asking, which told me everything I needed to know about how much they wanted this buried. For weeks after, I had nightmares about those announcements, about children's names echoing through speakers while their parents searched frantically. I called the FBI, filed a report, but the agent who took my statement seemed unsurprised, tired even. "International waters," he said, like that explained everything. "We're aware of the situation. Thank you for your report." That was it. No follow-up, no investigation that I ever heard about. Jennifer, the pediatrician from Dallas, texted me once to say they'd made it home safely too. Then her number was disconnected. I never found out what happened to the children whose names were called. Sometimes I Google them. Sophia Martinez missing. Christopher Johnson disappeared. But nothing ever comes up. It's like they never existed. Noah doesn't remember much about the cruise now, thank God. He just knows we came home early because Mom got sick. But I remember everything. The way those men moved through the ship like they belonged there. The casual efficiency of their hunting. The perfect cover of thousands of distracted tourists. Sometimes, when I'm at a crowded mall or amusement park and hear a child's name called over the loudspeaker, my whole body goes cold, and I find myself scanning the crowd, looking for men who are watching too closely, smiling too widely, wearing uniforms that don't quite fit. The Atlantic was rougher than usual that September, and most passengers had already retreated to their cabins by the time everything went sideways. I'd been on the ship for 3 days, one of those mid-sized vessels that runs the New York to Southampton route. Nothing glamorous but comfortable enough. My cabin was on the 7th floor, just a small room with a porthole that stayed fogged up from the temperature difference between the ocean air and the ship's heating system. After 8 years with Boston PD and another 2 running my own security consulting firm, I'd gotten pretty good at reading people, noticing patterns that didn't belong. My sister had practically forced this trip on me after my divorce papers came through, told me 7 days at sea would help me reset, stop obsessing over surveillance footage and threat assessments for corporate clients who paid too much for peace of mind. She wasn't wrong. The first couple days had been exactly the kind of mindless relaxation I needed. Mediocre food at the buffet, a comedy show that made me laugh exactly once, and long hours sitting on the deck watching the horizon bob up and down. Everything changed on night 3, right around 11:30 in the main lounge. I'd been sitting at the bar with a glass of bourbon, watching the bartender, a Romanian kid named Anton who couldn't have been older than 25, juggle drink orders from increasingly drunk passengers. That's when the shouting started near the casino entrance. 2 men, both in their 40s, expensive clothing but wearing it wrong, like they'd bought it specifically for this trip. The bigger one had shoulders that stretched his navy blazer to its limits, and when he shoved the smaller guy, it wasn't just anger. It was calculated, theatrical even. The smaller man crashed into a table where 4 women were playing cards, sending chips and drinks flying everywhere. Then I noticed something that made every instinct from my police days light up. 3 other men, scattered throughout the lounge, all stood up at exactly the same moment. They weren't rushing to help or gawking like everyone else. They were moving with purpose, converging on the scene like they'd rehearsed it. The next 60 seconds turned the lounge into complete chaos. While everyone was focused on the 2 men fighting, the 3 others who'd stood up pulled out knives. Not kitchen knives or pocket knives, but ceramic blades, the kind that don't set off metal detectors. One of them, a wiry guy with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, went straight for the purses and jewelry the card-playing women had left on their table. Another moved behind the bar where Anton stood frozen, and the third positioned himself at the main exit. The big guy who'd started the fight suddenly had a knife too, pressing it against the smaller man's throat while rifling through his pockets. That's when I realized the smaller man wasn't random. He was wearing a Patek Philippe watch worth at least 40 grand, and his wedding ring had a diamond that caught the light like a disco ball. The attackers had marked him earlier, probably watched him winning big at the casino or flashing cash at dinner. Nobody was screaming yet. It happened too fast for anyone to process what they were seeing. I'd left my service weapon at home, obviously. You can't bring guns on cruise ships. But I still had my tactical pen clipped to my pocket, a habit from the job. Without thinking it through, which was probably stupid, I stood up and moved toward the guy threatening Anton. He had the bartender's tip jar in one hand, and his blade in the other, sweeping it back and forth to keep Anton pressed against the wall of bottles. I grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the bar, they still had them even though nobody could smoke inside, and brought it down hard on the attacker's wrist. The crack was audible even over the growing panic in the room. His knife clattered across the floor, and Anton, bless him, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bottle of vodka and smashed it over the guy's head, dropping him instantly. But that's when I made a mistake. I bent down to grab the ceramic knife, and when I stood back up, the scarred one was already moving toward me. His blade held low and professional, like someone who'd done this before. The lounge had erupted into full panic now. Passengers scrambling for exits, tables overturning, glass breaking everywhere. The scarred man lunged at me with a boxer's footwork, quick jabs with the blade that forced me backward toward the windows overlooking the dark ocean. I managed to parry twice with the knife I'd picked up, but this guy knew what he was doing. He feinted left, then slashed right, catching my forearm and opening a gash that immediately soaked my sleeve with blood. The pain was sharp and hot, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind him, I could see the big guy dragging the rich passenger toward a service door, still pressing the blade to his throat while his partner stuffed jewelry and wallets into a canvas bag. They were working fast, methodical, like they'd done this exact thing before. I kicked a chair into the scarred man's path, buying myself 2 seconds to grab a champagne bottle from an abandoned table. When he came at me again, I swung it like a baseball bat, connecting with his shoulder and spinning him sideways into the piano. That's when ship security finally showed up. 2 officers in white uniforms who looked like they'd never dealt with anything worse than a drunk passenger falling in the pool. They had batons but no guns, and they hesitated at the entrance, trying to make sense of the scene. The attackers didn't hesitate at all. The one at the exit whistled, sharp and loud like calling a dog, and suddenly they were all moving, abandoning their victims and loot, heading for different exits with practiced efficiency. The scarred one rolled away from the piano, clutching his shoulder but still mobile. and disappeared through a door marked crew only. The big guy shoved his hostage to the floor and vanished through the service entrance he'd been heading toward. Within 15 seconds, they were all gone, leaving behind a lounge that looked like a hurricane had hit it. Blood on the carpet, broken glass everywhere, passengers huddled behind overturned furniture, and me standing there with a slashed arm and a bloody champagne bottle, trying to explain to security that this wasn't just a bar fight gone wrong. The ship's medical center was on deck 3, and the doctor, a Hungarian woman named Dr. Kovac with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, stitched my arm while I tried to convince the head of security that we had a serious problem. Captain Morrison, finally someone who seemed competent, showed up 20 minutes later, still buttoning his uniform jacket. I laid it out for him. The ceramic weapons, the coordinated movements, the crew-only door escape routes, the fact that they'd targeted specific wealthy passengers. These weren't opportunistic thieves or drunk troublemakers. They'd studied the ship's layout, identified marks, and planned their exits. The captain's face went pale when I mentioned the ceramic knives. "Those don't show up on our scanners," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Dr. Kovac paused mid-stitch when I described how they'd moved through the lounge, each man knowing exactly where to go. "How many passengers boarded in New York?" I asked. Morrison pulled out a tablet, scrolled through some files. 837, he said. "But we don't photograph passengers, only check passports against the manifest." I convinced Morrison to pull the security footage from embarkation day, and we spent the next 3 hours in a cramped office behind the bridge, watching grainy video on monitors that looked like they hadn't been upgraded since the 90s. Anton, who'd insisted on helping after his shift ended, turned out to have a photographer's eye for faces. He spotted them first, 5 men who'd boarded separately but all within the same 30-minute window, each carrying similar black duffel bags, each walking with that same controlled gait I'd noticed in the lounge. They'd spread out immediately after boarding, no acknowledgement of each other, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. We tracked them through the ship's cameras over the next 2 days. They ate at different restaurants, used different pools, never appeared together in public. But Anton noticed something I'd missed. They all had cabins on deck 2, the cheapest interior rooms, all in the same corridor. "Who books 5 separate interior cabins on a transatlantic crossing?" Anton asked, and that's when it clicked. I asked Morrison to check the booking records. All 5 reservations had been made on the same day, 6 weeks ago, all paid with prepaid credit cards, all using different travel agencies, but with sequential booking reference numbers. Morrison wanted to search their cabins immediately, but I stopped him. "They know we're onto them now," I said. "If we spook them, they might do something desperate. We're in the middle of the Atlantic, nowhere to run, but that also means nowhere for passengers to escape to either. Instead, I suggested we monitor them, figure out their next move." The captain agreed, assigning his 2 best security officers to shadow the corridors near their cabins. But these guys were smart. For the next 18 hours, none of them left their rooms. No room service orders, no bathroom breaks that we could detect, nothing. It was like they'd vanished inside those cabins. Then Anton, who'd been checking the dining records on his own initiative, found something interesting. Over the past 2 days, someone had been ordering massive amounts of food from the midnight buffet, enough for 15 people, and charging it to a cabin belonging to an elderly couple from Vermont, the Andersons, who'd been eating in the main dining room every night. When we checked the security footage from the buffet, we saw one of our suspects, the big guy from the fight, loading up multiple plates at 2 in the morning, then disappearing toward the service elevator. The pieces started coming together when Morrison pulled up the ship's blueprints. The service elevator from the buffet area connected to a maintenance corridor that ran along deck 2, right behind the row of cabins where our 5 suspects were staying. But here's what made my spine tingle. That same corridor led directly to the ship's storage hold, where passenger valuables were kept in safety deposit boxes. The cruise line marketed it as a secure service for travelers carrying expensive jewelry or large amounts of cash. Morrison's face went white when he realized what I was suggesting. "There's probably $3 million worth of items in that hold," he whispered. The attack in the lounge hadn't been the real crime. It was a distraction, a test run to see how security would respond, how long it would take, what kind of resistance they'd meet. They were planning something much bigger, and we were already on day 4 of a 7-day crossing. The next port was Southampton, but we had a brief stop in the Azores in 36 hours to refuel. If they were planning to rob the storage hold, they'd do it right before the Azores, then disappear into the Portuguese islands before anyone realized what had happened. We had less than 36 hours to stop them, and Morrison was already talking about alerting the Coast Guard, requesting a military escort, all the official procedures that would take too long and probably alert our suspects that we were onto them. I proposed something different. Let them think they're invisible, I said, but we set a trap. The plan was risky but simple. We'd move all the real valuables out of the storage hold that night, replace them with fake jewelry and empty boxes, then wait for them to make their move. Morrison hesitated. The liability issues alone could end his career. But he knew we didn't have many options. That night, while most passengers were at the captain's formal dinner, Morrison, Anton, 2 trusted security officers, and I quietly emptied the storage hold. We packed everything into the captain's personal safe and 3 secured crew lockers, photographing each item for insurance purposes. Anton had a cousin who worked in the ship's theater, and we borrowed costume jewelry, spray-painted rocks to look like gold bars, even filled some boxes with poker chips from the casino. By 4 in the morning, the storage hold looked exactly the same, but contained nothing worth more than a few $100s. The waiting was the worst part. 28 hours passed with no movement from their cabins. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I'd misread the whole situation. Then, at exactly 3:15 a.m. on our last night before the Azores, the ship's fire alarm went off in the kitchen, a grease fire that required all available crew to respond. Except I'd been watching the kitchen cameras, and there was no fire. Someone had triggered the alarm manually. Morrison and I stayed hidden in a maintenance closet near the storage hold, while chaos erupted above us. Through the door's vent, we heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast, but quiet. They had a key card that shouldn't have existed, opening the hold like they owned the place. We waited until all 5 were inside. Then Morrison hit the emergency lockdown he'd rigged earlier. The magnetic locks engaged with a solid thunk, trapping them inside with their worthless haul. When security opened the door 20 minutes later, the 5 men were standing among scattered costume jewelry and spray-painted rocks, their canvas bags half filled with fake gold bars. The scarred one actually laughed when he realized what had happened, shaking his head like he appreciated the play. Portuguese police were waiting when we docked in the Azores 6 hours later, and the FBI met us in Southampton with a warrant for the whole crew. Turns out these guys were part of a Romanian crime ring that had hit 3 other cruise lines in the past 2 years. Always with the same method. Board with fake identities, create a distraction, then clean out the ship's valuables before vanishing at port. The FBI agent told me they'd stolen over $12 million total, always picking transatlantic routes where security was lighter and passengers carried more cash and jewelry. The ceramic knives were custom-made in Prague, designed specifically to beat ship security. What really got me was finding out about the inside help. A crew member in reservations had been feeding them information about wealthy passengers and cabin assignments for a cut of the profits. They caught him trying to board a flight to Bucharest the day after we docked. Morrison offered me a job as the cruise line's new head of security, but I turned it down. The ocean's beautiful and all, but I'll stick to land where criminals can't trap you in a metal box for 7 days. Anton ended up testifying at the trial and used the reward money to open his own bar in Boston. He named it the Ceramic Knife, which I told him was terrible marketing, but he didn't care. Sometimes I stop by for a drink and we talk about that night, how close those guys came to pulling off the perfect heist. My arm healed up fine, just left a thin white scar that aches when it rains. Every time I see a cruise ship advertisement now, I wonder how many people realize they're basically volunteering to be locked in a floating city with complete strangers, hoping everyone's exactly who they claim to be. The afternoon sun was beating down on the pool deck when everything changed. I was 38 then, managing a hardware store in Phoenix, and we'd saved for 2 years to take this cruise. Me, my wife Lisa, our teenage daughter Madison, and my dad Walter. He'd just turned 65 and retired from his job at the post office after 40 years. The man never took vacations, always said he'd travel when he retired, so we surprised him with this trip for his birthday. We were somewhere between Florida and Jamaica, second day at sea on a 7-day cruise that was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Dad was actually enjoying himself for once, laughing at Madison's attempts to teach him how to play shuffleboard, his face red from the sun despite the SPF 50 Lisa kept slathering on him. I remember the exact moment because Madison had just scored her first point and was doing this ridiculous victory dance when Dad's shuffleboard stick clattered onto the deck. His right hand was clutching his chest, fingers digging into his Hawaiian shirt, the ridiculous one with the parrots that Madison had bought him specifically for this trip. His face went from sunburn red to this awful grayish color in seconds. He tried to say something, but all that came out was this strangled gasp before his knees buckled. I caught him before he hit the deck, and his weight nearly took me down with him. His eyes were wide, terrified, and he kept grabbing at his chest like he was trying to tear something out. Lisa started screaming for help, while Madison stood there frozen, still holding her shuffleboard stick like she didn't understand what was happening. A crew member in a white uniform appeared within maybe 30 seconds, felt like hours, and immediately called for medical on his radio. They brought a wheelchair, but Dad couldn't even sit up properly. He kept slumping forward, his breathing coming in these horrible wheezes. We ended up carrying him, me under his arms, the crew member taking his legs, while Lisa ran ahead, clearing the path through the crowds of sunbathers who were all staring now. The medical center was down on deck 2, tucked behind the photo gallery where they try to sell you overpriced pictures of yourself boarding the ship. The smell hit me first, not the antiseptic hospital smell you'd expect, but this weird mixture of mildew and air freshener, like they were trying to cover up something. The waiting area had 3 plastic chairs and a water cooler that was empty, just the blue bottle sitting there collecting dust. The doctor, though I'm still not sure he was actually a doctor, introduced himself as Dr. Petrov, speaking with a thick Eastern European accent. He was maybe 28, 30 at most, with acne scars on his cheeks and medical scrubs that looked like they'd been washed too many times, all faded and thin. The nurse with him, a woman named Carla from the Philippines, at least seemed to know what she was doing. She got Dad onto the examination table, which was really just a padded bench bolted to the wall, and started checking his vitals. Dr. Petrov listened to Dad's chest with a stethoscope that looked older than me, then turned to us with this expression that made my stomach clench. "Is probable cardiac event," he said, like he was telling us Dad had a cold. "We give aspirin, monitor. Next port is 10, maybe 12 hours, he's stable enough." But Dad didn't look stable. His lips had this bluish tinge, and he kept clutching at his chest, tears streaming down his face from the pain. Lisa lost it then, and I'd never seen my wife like that in 16 years of marriage. She grabbed Dr. Petrov by his faded scrubs, actually grabbed him, and started shouting about helicopters, about calling the Coast Guard, about doing something real instead of just watching her father-in-law die. The doctor just stood there, blinking rapidly, while Carla gently pried Lisa's hands away. "Ma'am, please understand," Carla said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes showing she knew exactly how bad this was. "The helicopter evacuation costs minimum $50,000. Insurance usually no cover, and we need approval from corporate office first. Can take 4 or 5 hours just for paperwork." She showed us the medical supply cabinet then, probably trying to reassure us they had equipment, but it was pathetic. Some bandages, basic medications in bottles with labels so faded you could barely read them, an oxygen tank that looked like it belonged in a museum, and an EKG machine with a cracked screen held together with medical tape. Dad started vomiting then, this violent heaving that had him crying out in pain with each spasm. "Dr. Petrov seemed genuinely surprised, like this wasn't in whatever manual he'd memorized. He fumbled with the oxygen tank, trying to get the mask on Dad's face, but the elastic strap snapped the moment he stretched it. He had to hold it manually while Carla searched for tape. I asked about nitroglycerin, about clot-busting drugs, about anything I'd heard of from medical shows, and Petrov just shook his head. "We don't stock such things. Too expensive, expire too fast, corporate policy." That's when I noticed the defibrillator in the corner, covered in dust with a note taped to it that said, "Out of order, awaiting parts." Madison was sobbing in the corner, calling her grandfather's name, while Dad's breathing got more labored, each breath sounding like he was drowning in his own lungs. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. We took turns holding that oxygen mask to Dad's face because they only had one roll of medical tape, and it wasn't strong enough to hold the weight. Carla kept checking his pulse manually because the heart monitor's battery was dead, and the replacement was on order from corporate. Dr. Petrov disappeared for an hour, and when he came back, he smelled like cigarettes and wouldn't meet our eyes. Around hour 2, Dad started having what Carla quietly called episodes. His whole body would go rigid, eyes rolling back, lasting maybe 20 or 30 seconds each time. After the third one, even Petrov looked scared. He finally admitted he'd only been working cruise ships for 3 months, that he'd been a general practitioner in Romania for just 2 years before this, mostly dealing with colds and stomach bugs. The cruise line had hired him because he'd work for a third of what American doctors wanted. I'll never forget the conversation with the cruise director who showed up around hour 4. Gregory something or other, this spray-tanned guy in his 40s with veneers so white they hurt to look at, wearing a uniform with more fake gold than a costume shop. He walked in while Dad was mid-episode, waited for it to pass like it was just an inconvenience, then launched into this rehearsed speech about liability and international maritime law. "Your father signed a waiver when he boarded," he said, pulling out his phone to show me the terms and conditions nobody ever reads. Section 47B clearly states that medical facilities are limited and guests travel at their own risk. When Lisa started crying harder, he offered us a 20% discount on our next cruise and free drink packages for the rest of this trip. I wanted to throw him through the porthole, but I couldn't leave Dad's side. His skin had gone from gray to almost translucent, and I could see the veins in his temples pulsing irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes barely moving at all. By hour 6, other passengers had started gathering outside the medical center. Word had gotten around the ship, and people were recording with their phones through the small window in the door. Some woman from Kansas City actually knocked and asked if we could keep it down because they were trying to enjoy the comedy show next door. That's when I snapped. I stormed out into the hallway and told everyone exactly what was happening, how the defibrillator was broken, how they wouldn't call for evacuation, how the doctor admitted he wasn't qualified, everything. People started posting it on social media immediately. Within an hour, Gregory was back, this time with the captain, a Norwegian man named Eriksson who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. They offered to call for evacuation now, but only if we signed papers absolving the cruise line of all responsibility, and agreed to pay all costs up front. They had a credit card machine right there, ready to charge us the $50,000 deposit. Madison was the one who thought of calling the news. While Lisa and I argued with the captain about the evacuation, she used the ship's Wi-Fi, $15 for 30 minutes, because even in an emergency they were nickel and diming us, to email every news station she could find. She sent them videos of the broken equipment, recordings of Gregory's speech about liability, pictures of the out-of-order defibrillator. CNN actually called back within 20 minutes, and suddenly Captain Eriksson's phone started ringing non-stop. The cruise line's corporate office was in full panic mode. They approved the helicopter evacuation, but by then we'd been in that moldy medical center for 7.5 hours. Dad had stopped having episodes, which Carla said wasn't necessarily good news. He was barely responsive, his pulse so weak she had to check it at his neck because she couldn't find it at his wrist anymore. The helicopter arrived at hour 9, and getting Dad up to the landing pad was a nightmare I still dream about. The ship's elevator to the upper deck was undergoing maintenance, so 6 crew members had to carry him up 4 flights of stairs on a stretcher that was held together with duct tape on one corner. One of the handles actually broke midway, and this kid who couldn't have been older than 19 had to bear Dad's weight on his shoulder. The wind on the top deck was brutal, the helicopter hovering but unable to land because the cruise ship's landing pad hadn't been certified in 3 years, another cost-cutting measure. They had to lower a rescue basket, and watching them load my unconscious father into it, his body limp as a rag doll while the basket swayed in the wind 30 feet above the deck, was the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Lisa couldn't watch, and Madison filmed everything, later telling me she did it because she wanted evidence if something went wrong. Dad survived, barely. The doctors at the hospital in Fort Lauderdale said another hour, and he would have been gone. He'd had a massive heart attack, and the lack of proper treatment for those 9 hours had caused additional damage. His heart function was down to 30%. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU, had to have triple bypass surgery, and now, 2 years later, he still can't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to rest. The medical bills hit $400,000, and the cruise line fought us on every penny, claiming we'd refused their initial treatment plan and created the delay ourselves by involving the media. We're still in litigation, but at least Dad is alive. The cruise line never admitted fault, just quietly settled the CNN story with a statement about reviewing their medical preparedness protocols. Dr. Petrov still works for them, just on a different ship. I know because Madison found him on social media, posting pictures from the crew deck, smiling like nothing ever happened. They did fix the defibrillator, though. That made it into their press release about their commitment to passenger safety. "22 years old, and I'd never been on anything bigger than my uncle's fishing boat back in Colorado. But there I was, standing on deck 7 of this massive ship, watching the Mexican coastline fade into darkness, while 4,000 other passengers partied around me. I'd saved for 2 years waiting tables at a greasy diner in Denver, pulling double shifts every weekend, telling myself it would all be worth it once I finally got on that ship. My roommate Ashley thought I was crazy to go alone, kept saying I should wait until we could go together after she saved up, but I needed this trip. I needed to prove to myself that I could do something big without anyone holding my hand. The first 2 days had been incredible, snorkeling at our port stop, meeting other solo travelers at the poolside mixers, eating more shrimp at the buffet than any human probably should. That third night, I decided to splurge on the steakhouse, the one where you had to make reservations and pay an extra $70 just to walk through the door. The dining room had these floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, candle-lit tables with actual cloth napkins, and servers who remembered your name after hearing it once. My waiter, this guy named Dominic with a thick Italian accent, recommended the ribeye with herb butter, said it was the best cut they'd gotten in weeks. When that plate arrived, I'm not gonna lie, I took like 5 photos before even picking up my fork. The steak was thick as a dictionary, charred black on the edges but bleeding pink inside, swimming in this green butter that had chunks of garlic and rosemary. First bite tasted a little metallic, kind of sharp on my tongue, but Dominic assured me that was just the dry aging process, something about enzymes breaking down the proteins. The couple next to me, the Brennans from Wisconsin, were celebrating their 40th anniversary, and Mr. Brennan kept joking that his steak was so good he might leave his wife for the chef. We laughed, shared travel stories, and I cleaned my entire plate, even sopping up the leftover butter with the complimentary bread. Around midnight, I woke up to my stomach doing these weird flips, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your whole body lurches. The room was pitch black except for this thin strip of moonlight coming through the balcony door, and the ship was rocking more than usual, making everything worse. I tried to ignore it, told myself I'd just eaten too much too fast, maybe mixed too many foods at once. But then came this sharp twisting pain right below my ribs, like someone was wringing out my intestines like a wet towel. I barely made it to the tiny bathroom before everything came up. The steak, the potatoes, the 3 mojitos I'd had at the pool bar earlier. all of it burning my throat on the way back up. The vomiting wouldn't stop. These violent waves that left me hugging the toilet, my whole body shaking and covered in cold sweat. Between episodes, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with panic. The vomit had this dark, almost coffee ground texture to it, and there were these red streaks that definitely weren't from anything I'd eaten. I tried calling guest services from the phone next to the bed, but the line just rang and rang. No answer. My roommate for the cruise, this girl named Bethany from Oregon who I'd been matched with through the solo traveler program, wasn't in her bed, probably still at the nightclub on deck 12. I grabbed my room key, shoved my feet into flip-flops, and stumbled out into the hallway. One hand pressed against my stomach, the other trailing along the wall for support. The corridors were empty, just these endless stretches of identical doors and that weird cruise ship carpet, with the swirling patterns that made my nausea worse. Every few steps, I had to stop and lean against the wall, breathing through my nose, trying not to throw up again. The infirmary was on deck 2, according to the map I'd studied on the first day, which meant taking the elevator down 5 floors. While waiting for it to arrive, I heard someone else retching behind a nearby door, then another door further down, these horrible gagging sounds echoing through the hallway. The elevator took forever, and when it finally opened, there were already 3 people inside, all of them looking as rough as I felt. This middle-aged man in a Disney cruise shirt was bent over, gripping the handrail, his face this greenish-gray color I'd never seen on human skin before. A woman, maybe in her 30s, was sitting on the floor in the corner, holding a plastic ice bucket that reeked of bile. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. A teenage boy was slumped against the back wall, his legs shaking so bad his knees kept knocking together. Nobody said anything. We just stood there in our misery as the elevator crawled down, stopping at every single floor to pick up more sick passengers. By deck 4, we were packed in like sardines, 12 or 13 of us, the air thick with the smell of sweat and vomit and fear. This elderly woman next to me kept whispering, "This isn't right, this isn't right," over and over, clutching a rosary in her trembling fingers. When the elevator doors opened on deck 2, I thought I was hallucinating. The hallway leading to the infirmary was packed with people, a line stretching all the way back to the crew quarters. There must have been 60, maybe 70 passengers, all in various states of distress. Some were sitting on the floor with their backs against the walls, heads between their knees. Others were standing but swaying, using the walls or their companions for support. I saw Mrs. Brennan from dinner, the sweet lady from Wisconsin, throwing up into a trash bag while her husband rubbed her back, his own face pale and sweaty. There were parents carrying limp children, a pregnant woman crying while her partner fanned her with a cruise brochure, and near the front of the line, a man had actually passed out, lying flat on that ugly carpet while his wife screamed for help. The smell hit me like a physical force, human waste, vomit, and underneath it all, this metallic scent that reminded me of the steak from dinner, making my stomach clench all over again. I took my place at the end of the line, sliding down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled up to my chest. The woman next to me, still wearing her evening dress from whatever fancy event she'd attended, told me she'd been waiting for 2 hours already. 2 hours. She said the infirmary only had 1 doctor and 2 nurses for the entire ship, and they were completely overwhelmed. People who'd made it inside were coming back out saying the doctor was just giving everyone the same medicine, some generic anti-nausea pills, and sending them back to their rooms. No IV fluids for dehydration, no real examination, just pills and a pat on the back. The woman's husband had gone to find water somewhere, she said, because the crew had stopped responding to room service calls, and the nearest working water fountain was 3 decks up. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to stand up to adjust her position, her legs gave out completely, sending her crashing back to the floor. After another hour of waiting, barely moving forward in line, I watched a crew member in a white uniform push through the crowd, heading for the infirmary doors. People were grabbing at him, begging for help, for water, for information, but he just kept his head down and pushed forward. When he reached the doors, I heard him speaking rapidly into his radio, in what sounded like Filipino, and I caught a few words in English. Containment, corporate, and media blackout. The doors opened just long enough for him to slip inside, and in that brief moment, I glimpsed the chaos within. Gurneys lining the walls with people hooked up to IVs, a nurse running between patients, and the doctor, this exhausted-looking Indian man, arguing with someone in a suit who was definitely not medical staff. The suit was waving papers around, pointing at the sick passengers, shaking his head violently. Then the doors closed again, and we were left in the hallway with our suffering, the line not moving at all anymore. My dehydration was getting dangerous. I could feel it in the way my vision kept going dark at the edges, how my tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of my mouth. The woman in the evening dress had stopped responding when people talked to her, just staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. I knew I needed fluids desperately, but when I tried to stand up to go search for water, the hallway tilted sideways and I crashed into the wall, my legs like jelly. That's when this crew member, a young Filipino guy who couldn't have been older than 19, knelt down next to me. He looked around nervously, then pressed a half-empty water bottle into my hands, whispering in accented English that I needed to get back to my room immediately. He said the restaurant on deck 7, the fancy one where I'd eaten. Their freezer had broken 2 days ago, but management made them serve the meat anyway. Over 300 people had eaten there in the last 48 hours. He said corporate was flying in their own doctors tomorrow morning. But tonight, they were under strict orders to minimize treatment, to avoid creating a paper trail that could lead to lawsuits. Before I could ask him anything else, his supervisor appeared, barking at him in Tagalog, and he scrambled away. But his words kept spinning in my head as I sipped the precious water. Broken freezer, 300 sick people, minimizing treatment. I started noticing things I'd missed before in my misery. The crew members weren't drinking the ship's water. They all had sealed bottles from some external supplier. The security guards at the end of the hallway were wearing medical masks, something I'd never seen on a cruise before. And most telling of all, I spotted 2 passengers from first class, the ones who'd been at the captain's table that first night, being escorted through a side door directly into the infirmary, bypassing the entire line. The woman next to me saw it too and started crying, not from pain but from rage, realizing that even here, even in this nightmare, money determined who got saved first. She tried to scream about it, to alert the others, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat too damaged from hours of vomiting. Around 5 in the morning, after I'd been in that hallway for nearly 5 hours, something shifted. The man in the suit came out of the infirmary with 2 security officers, and they started moving through the crowd, checking room numbers on people's key cards. When they got to me, the suit looked at his tablet, frowned, and told the security guards to escort me back to my room. I tried to protest, told him I needed medical attention, that I could barely stand, but he just smiled this cold corporate smile and said the doctor had determined I was well enough to recover in my cabin. The security guards lifted me up by my arms, and I was too weak to fight them. As they half-carried, half-dragged me toward the elevator, I heard the suit telling others the same thing, clearing out the hallway by force. The pregnant woman was sobbing, begging for help, but they just kept moving people out. The man who'd been unconscious on the floor was being loaded onto a luggage cart, his wife stumbling along behind, and nobody was even pretending to provide medical care anymore. They dumped me in my room and told me to stay there until further notice. That room service would bring me electrolyte drinks and crackers within the hour. Of course, nothing came. Bethany, my roommate, was in her bed, curled up in a ball, her sheets soaked with sweat. She'd been sick too, had tried to get help around 3 in the morning but never even made it to the infirmary, collapsing in the elevator. Another passenger had dragged her back to our room and left her there. We spent the next 18 hours taking turns in the bathroom, sharing the last of our bottled water, listening to the chaos in the hallway as more and more people got sick. I found out later when we finally docked in Mexico that 43 passengers had to be hospitalized immediately, 7 ended up in intensive care, and 2 elderly passengers actually died during that nightmare night at sea. The cruise line offered us a 25% discount on a future cruise as compensation, made us sign papers saying we wouldn't talk to the media, wouldn't post on social media, wouldn't sue. Most people signed just to get off that floating petri dish. I didn't sign anything, which is why I can tell you this story now, why I'm naming the cruise line Royal Atlantic Ventures, ship designation Paradise Queen, sailing out of Galveston on March 15, 2022. I spent 22 years fighting fires in Chicago, but nothing in all that time prepared me for what happened last April aboard the Celestial Dream. My daughter Megan had convinced me to take that Mediterranean cruise about 6 months after I retired. Kept saying I deserved it after all those years of service, that I needed to finally relax and see the world beyond smoke and sirens. She'd found this deal online, 10 days through the Mediterranean, and basically wouldn't take no for an answer. Even drove me to the airport herself to make sure I actually went. The ship was massive, one of those floating cities with 8 restaurants, 3 pools, and enough activities to keep 2,000 passengers busy for weeks. We'd been at sea for 4 days, had just left Barcelona that morning heading toward Nice, and I was actually starting to enjoy myself, learning to play shuffleboard with a group of retirees from Michigan who'd adopted me into their morning coffee club. The weather had been perfect the entire trip, that kind of Mediterranean sunshine you see in travel magazines, calm seas that barely made you remember you were floating on thousands of feet of water. That afternoon started like any other. I'd just finished lunch at the buffet on Deck 7, grilled salmon with those fancy little potatoes they served every day, and was heading down to my cabin for a quick nap before the evening's entertainment. The first sign something was wrong came around 3:30 when I noticed the horizon through my porthole window had this strange dark purple color, like a fresh bruise spreading across the sky. Then came the announcement from the captain, very calm, very professional, telling us we might experience some rough seas and suggesting passengers secure any loose items in their cabins. I remember thinking it was odd how the crew members I passed in the hallway were moving with this urgent efficiency, not quite running, but definitely not strolling, their faces tight with something I recognized from my firefighting days, that controlled concern professionals get when they know something civilians don't yet understand. Within 20 minutes, the ship started this slow, unnatural rocking that made my coffee mug slide across the desk in my cabin. I went out to the balcony, and what I saw made every instinct from 2 decades of emergency response kick in. Waves that looked like moving buildings, white foam spraying up higher than our deck, and that purple sky had turned into something biblical, clouds so black and low you could almost touch them. Other passengers were still walking around, some taking photos, completely oblivious to what was coming. But I started gathering my important stuff, passport, wallet, medications, and put them in a waterproof bag I always travel with, old habits from the job. I tried calling Megan, but the satellite connection was already getting spotty. Managed to send her a quick text saying we hit rough weather, but everything was fine. Didn't want to worry her. By 4 o'clock, they'd closed all the outdoor decks and the captain came back on. This time his voice had lost that casual tone, telling everyone to return to their cabins immediately and wait for further instructions. I couldn't stay in my cabin though, not with what I was seeing through that porthole. Waves that would disappear the entire view, then drop away to show nothing but angry gray water in every direction. I made my way up to Deck 5 where the main dining hall was, figuring if things went bad, I wanted to be somewhere with multiple exits, not trapped in a metal box 7 floors down. The dining hall was this massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers. Must have had seating for 500 people easy, and right now it had maybe 30 confused passengers sitting at tables, trying to eat dinner while plates slid around despite the staff's attempts to steady them. That's when the first big wave hit. Not just rough seas anymore, but something that made the entire ship lurch sideways so hard that a grand piano on the stage broke free from its restraints and slid across the floor like it weighed nothing, crashing into the wall with a sound I'll never forget. Everything changed in seconds. Tables flipped, glass shattered everywhere, and people went tumbling across the floor mixed with food, broken dishes, and furniture that had become deadly projectiles. An elderly woman near me got thrown from her chair and slid 15 feet before hitting a pillar, her husband crawling after her while the ship tilted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The emergency alarm started blaring, this piercing electronic shriek that mixed with human screams and the sound of everything that wasn't bolted down, crashing from one side of the room to the other. I managed to grab onto a support column, helped pull a young couple behind it just as another wave hit from the opposite side, and this time I heard something structural give way, a deep groaning of metal that you feel in your bones more than hear. The lights flickered and went to emergency power, casting everything in this sick yellow glow, and through the windows all you could see was water, not sky and horizon like normal, just solid walls of black water rushing past like we were underwater. A crew member, this Filipino kid who couldn't have been older than 25, came stumbling through the chaos with blood running down his forehead, screaming for everyone to put on life jackets, pointing toward an emergency station near the entrance. Half the passengers couldn't even stand up with the ship rolling like it was, and I watched in horror as another massive wave visible through the window seemed to pause at the glass for a moment before smashing through, sending freezing seawater flooding across the dining hall floor. People were sliding in the water now, tables floating, and I heard someone yelling that water was coming up from the lower decks through the stairwells. The ship would tilt so far to one side that you were basically standing on the wall, then slam back the other way, and each time it happened, you could hear things breaking deep in the ship's belly, expensive things, important things, maybe vital things. I managed to reach the life jacket station, started throwing the orange vests to anyone I could reach while trying to keep my footing on the floor that had become a river of seawater mixed with broken glass and debris. There was this family from somewhere in the Midwest, parents with 2 teenage kids, all 4 of them huddled together behind an overturned table. The father's arm bent at an unnatural angle, the mother holding a cloth napkin against a gash on her daughter's leg. I helped them into their life jackets, showed them how to pull the straps tight, and that's when the captain's voice came over the speakers again, except this time he was shouting the words nobody wants to hear on a ship. This is not a drill. All passengers and crew to muster stations immediately. Repeat, this is not a drill. The way he said it, you could hear the fear underneath the training, and that scared me more than the waves or the tilting or even the water rushing in. We tried to move as a group toward the muster station, but another wave hit, and suddenly the lights went out completely for about 10 seconds that felt like hours. Just total darkness, with invisible water sloshing around your legs, and people screaming from every direction. When the emergency lights kicked back on, I saw that the water in the dining hall was now waist-deep and rising fast, and through what was left of the windows, these waves that had to be 40, maybe 50 feet high, just mountains of water with white peaks that would lift the entire ship up like a toy before dropping it into the next valley. An older man next to me was having a panic attack, couldn't breathe, kept saying his wife was still in their cabin on deck 3, and I had to physically hold him back from trying to go down there because we could all hear it now. The sound of water rushing through the lower parts of the ship, doors banging open and closed, the deep creaking of a massive structure being pushed beyond what it was designed to handle. Getting to the muster station became like something out of a nightmare, where you're trying to run but can't move fast enough. We were basically climbing along the walls when the ship tilted, then sliding back down when it righted itself, all while fighting through water that was getting deeper by the minute. I saw a woman get swept away from her husband's grip, carried by the water toward the shattered windows, and 3 of us formed a human chain to pull her back, her face white with terror, coughing up seawater. The crew members who were supposed to be managing the evacuation looked just as terrified as the passengers. These young people who'd probably only ever done this in calm water drills, now faced with a ship that felt minutes away from rolling over completely. One of them, a girl with a thick Eastern European accent, was crying while she tried to do a head count. Her clipboard dissolved into wet pulp, mascara running down her cheeks as she kept repeating the evacuation protocols like a prayer. By the time we reached the muster station on deck 4, the situation had gone from dangerous to apocalyptic. The lifeboat area was chaos, with crew members trying to lower boats while the ship pitched so violently that the boats would swing out over the water, then come crashing back into the side of the ship. I watched one lifeboat get crushed like an aluminum can against the hull, just destroyed in seconds, and realized with this cold certainty that we might not have enough functional boats left, even if we could launch them. People were fighting to get closer to the remaining boats, families getting separated, and I saw a man push an elderly woman down to get ahead, the veneer of civilization disappearing as fast as our chances of survival. The wind was howling so loud you had to scream to be heard, rain coming sideways like bullets, and every few seconds another wave would sweep across the deck, taking anyone who wasn't holding on to something and washing them toward the railings or worse. That's when I heard it, the sound that made even the crew members stop what they were doing. This tremendous metallic shriek from somewhere below, followed by a shudder that ran through the entire ship like it had been punched by God himself. The floor beneath us suddenly tilted past 45 degrees and stayed there, people sliding down the deck in a tangle of bodies in life jackets, some going straight over the rail into the black churning ocean below. I managed to wrap my arms around a support pole, holding on while my feet dangled in the air, watching in absolute terror as the horizon through the rain seemed to be rotating, the ship beginning what felt like a slow-motion roll that would flip us completely. Water was pouring in from everywhere now, not just waves but from inside the ship itself, geysers shooting up through drain grates, cascading downstairs, and I could hear the engines making sounds they should never make, like dying animals trapped in the engine room. For 30 seconds, that lasted a lifetime. We hung there on the edge of capsizing, 2,000 people holding their breath, prayers in a dozen languages mixing with the storm's roar, waiting to see if we'd complete that roll into the Mediterranean. Then, impossibly, the ship started to right itself, fighting back against the storm with whatever was left of its stabilizers and the captain's desperate maneuvering, the deck slowly becoming horizontal again, though nothing felt stable or safe. A crew member with a radio was yelling that the Greek Coast Guard was 8 miles out, helicopters already in the air, and rescue ships pushing through the storm toward our position, but 8 miles in seas like this might as well have been 800. We spent the next 3 hours in pure survival mode, helping injured passengers, forming human barriers to keep people from getting washed overboard, bailing water with anything we could find while the ship limped along, lower in the water with each passing hour but somehow still floating. When the first helicopter appeared through the rain, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like salvation itself, people started crying, collapsing with relief, though we all knew it would take dozens of trips to evacuate everyone, and the ship was still taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. They evacuated the injured and elderly first, winching them up into helicopters that danced in the wind like leaves, and I stayed until almost the end, helping load people into rescue baskets, keeping panicked passengers calm while water lapped at our feet on what used to be the upper deck. It took 14 hours to get everyone off the Celestial Dream, and I was in one of the last groups to leave, watching from the rescue ship as our cruise liner, lit up by emergency floodlights from the Greek vessels, finally gave up its fight and slipped beneath the surface just after dawn. Nobody died that night, which the news kept calling a miracle, though 43 people ended up hospitalized and hundreds more with injuries that didn't make the statistics. They flew us to Athens, put us up in hotels, and cruise line representatives with practiced sympathy and liability waivers came around offering compensation and free future cruises that nobody in that room would ever take. I got home to Chicago 2 days later, Megan meeting me at O'Hare with tears streaming down her face, holding me like I might disappear if she let go. She'd seen the news coverage, those helicopter videos of the ship tilting at impossible angles, passengers clinging to railings while waves swept the decks, and she kept apologizing for pushing me to take the trip, which broke my heart because none of it was her fault. The official investigation blamed it on a rare meteorological phenomenon, a sudden pressure drop that created hurricane-force conditions in minutes, something that happens maybe once a decade in the Mediterranean. But knowing the science behind it doesn't stop the nightmares where I'm back on that tilting deck, watching people slide toward the rails, hearing that metal shriek that meant we were seconds from becoming another maritime disaster documentary. I still can't watch cruise ship commercials, and when friends talk about their vacation plans, I just nod and change the subject. Because how do you explain that 22 years of running into burning buildings didn't scare you half as much as one afternoon when nature decided to remind 2,000 tourists that the ocean doesn't care about your shuffleboard schedule or dinner reservations? "5 months ago, I was just another burned-out ICU nurse desperately needing a break from 12-hour shifts and the constant beeping of monitors. After watching 3 patients code in a single week at the hospital in Houston where I worked, I finally cashed in 2 years' worth of savings and booked myself on a 7-day cruise through the Eastern Caribbean. The Ocean Jewel was one of those massive ships you see in commercials. 16 decks of pure escapism with pools, restaurants, and enough activities to make you forget that the real world even existed. I remember standing at the port in Port Canaveral, staring up at this floating city and thinking that for once in my life, I was going to completely disconnect and just let myself breathe. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. Morning yoga on the upper deck, afternoon margaritas by the pool, and dinner at restaurants where I didn't have to eat standing up between patient rounds. Everything changed on the 3rd night, somewhere between the Bahamas and our next port. I'd gone to bed early after too much wine at the captain's dinner, one of those fancy affairs where they parade the officers around and everyone pretends they're not already sunburned and exhausted. My cabin was on deck 7, nothing special but comfortable enough, with a tiny balcony where I could sit and watch the dark ocean roll by. Around 2:47 a.m., I know the exact time because I'd developed that nurse habit of always checking the clock when something wakes me. I heard what sounded like someone running full speed down the corridor outside my door. Then came the screaming, not just one voice but several, the kind of raw, terrified sounds that make your whole body go rigid. In the ICU, you learn to differentiate between types of screams, and these weren't drunk party guests having too much fun. These were people in genuine distress, and before I could even think about it, my feet were on the floor and I was pulling on the jeans I'd thrown over the chair. The corridor was chaos when I cracked open my door. 3 cabins down, a middle-aged couple stood in their doorway, the woman clutching a torn nightgown to her chest while her husband had blood running from a gash above his eyebrow. Their cabin door hung at an odd angle, the lock mechanism completely destroyed like someone had taken a crowbar to it. Further down, I could see at least 2 more cabin doors standing wide open, and there was this weird chemical smell in the air, sharp and medicinal, that reminded me of the chloroform we'd studied in nursing school but haven't used in decades. A younger woman, maybe early 20s, was sitting on the floor against the wall, her wrists marked with deep red lines where zip ties had clearly been, and she kept repeating the same thing over and over. They had master keys. They had master keys. The emergency lighting had kicked on, casting these harsh shadows that made everything look even more nightmarish than it already was. What really made my gut twist was seeing the crew members who responded. 2 security officers showed up after what felt like forever, but was probably only 4 or 5 minutes, and instead of immediately calling for backup or starting to document the scene, they began ushering people back into their cabins, almost aggressively insistent that everyone needed to return to their rooms for their own safety. One of them, a tall guy with a Baltic accent and a name tag that read Dmitri, kept telling us there had been a minor disturbance and that everything was under control. But I could see into the Hamiltons' cabin. I'd met them at the pool bar the day before. A retired couple from Arizona celebrating their 40th anniversary, and their entire room had been ransacked. The safe had been pried open, clothes were everywhere, and Mrs. Hamilton was sitting on the bed with her hands still bound behind her back with those white zip ties that left deep marks in her skin. The security officer actually tried to block my view when he saw me looking, physically stepping between me and their doorway while insisting I needed to go back to my cabin immediately. Against every instinct screaming at me to help, I let them push me back toward my room, but not before I caught sight of something that made everything click into place. Near the emergency exit at the end of the corridor, there was a maintenance cart, one of those gray rolling things the housekeeping staff use, except this one had what looked like electronic equipment piled on top, the kind of signal jammers I'd seen demonstrated at a hospital security conference about protecting patient data. The cart was partially covered with a standard cleaning tarp, but I could see the corner of what was definitely a commercial-grade lock-picking gun, the expensive type that can open most hotel-style card readers in seconds. When Dmitri noticed me staring, he actually grabbed my upper arm, not hard enough to bruise but firm enough to make his point, and walked me back to my cabin personally. His partner, a shorter woman whose badge I couldn't read in the dim light, was already on her radio speaking in rapid Portuguese, and I distinctly heard her say something about damage control in English before switching back. I spent the next hour sitting on my bed with the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle, listening to the sounds outside gradually die down. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual in the middle of the ocean, but the ship's Wi-Fi was mysteriously undergoing maintenance when I tried to connect. Around 4 a.m., an announcement came over the PA system from someone claiming to be the hotel director, explaining that there had been an unfortunate incident involving a disturbed passenger who had been apprehended and confined. And they assured everyone that the situation was completely under control and that counseling would be available in the morning for anyone affected. But here's what that announcement didn't explain: why I could hear at least 5 different cabins reporting thefts when I pressed my ear to the door, or why the couple from cabin 7043 was describing 3 attackers, not 1. It definitely didn't explain why I heard that same security officer, Dmitri, telling someone on his radio to make sure the service elevator cameras stay off until we're done cleaning up. The next morning, the main dining hall was eerily normal, like someone had hit a reset button on the entire ship. Waiters smiled and poured coffee. The breakfast buffet gleamed under warming lights, and that same cheerful cruise director who'd been leading poolside games was making announcements about the day's activities in St. Thomas. But at least a third of the tables were empty, and those of us who did show up kept exchanging these knowing looks, like survivors of something we weren't supposed to talk about. I found the Hamiltons sitting in a corner booth, Mrs. Hamilton wearing long sleeves despite the warming morning sun, probably to hide the marks on her wrists. When I approached them, Mr. Hamilton immediately tensed up, but his wife grabbed his hand and nodded for me to sit. She leaned in close and whispered that they'd lost everything: passports, cash, her grandmother's wedding ring, about $12,000 worth of jewelry they'd brought for their anniversary. The security team had taken their statement at 5 a.m., she said, making air quotes with her fingers, and told them they'd be compensated through insurance if they signed some papers and agreed not to discuss the incident with other passengers to prevent panic. That's when things got really interesting. A man at the next table, close enough to overhear, turned around and introduced himself as Paul, a cybersecurity consultant from Seattle. He pulled out his phone and showed me something he'd managed to capture before the ship's Wi-Fi went down. A crew member's Facebook post from 2 days earlier, written in Tagalog but which he'd translated, joking about easy targets and big score coming. The crew member worked in guest services, had access to the passenger manifest, and knew exactly which cabins had elderly couples traveling with valuables. Paul had also noticed something I'd missed. 3 crew members had suddenly fallen ill that morning and been confined to quarters, including one from the security team. He'd overheard the staff captain telling another officer that they needed to contain this before we dock, and that corporate would handle it internally. Paul had been trying to reach the FBI through a satellite phone he'd borrowed from another passenger, but mysteriously, all outside communications were being blocked, supposedly due to technical difficulties. By noon, our little group of aware passengers had grown to about 15 people, all comparing notes in hushed conversations around the ship. A woman named Janet from cabin 7039 revealed that she'd actually seen her cabin steward, a guy she'd been tipping generously all week, standing in her doorway at 2:30 a.m. with 2 other men she didn't recognize. When she screamed, they'd run. but not before she noticed one of them carrying what looked like a master key card on a lanyard marked Security Override. Another passenger, a retired cop from Philadelphia named Frank, had done some investigating of his own and discovered that the cameras on Deck 7 had been undergoing maintenance for exactly the window when the attacks occurred, from 2:30 to 4 a.m. He'd also noticed that several of the crew members who'd been most friendly and chatty during the first 2 days were suddenly nowhere to be found, and when he'd asked about one particular room steward, he was told the man had been transferred to another deck just that morning. The pattern was becoming undeniable. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity, but a coordinated operation that required inside knowledge, master keys, and the ability to manipulate the ship's security systems. The breaking point came when we reached St. Thomas that afternoon. As the ship prepared to dock, Paul and I watched from the upper deck as 3 crew members were quietly escorted off through a service gangway, not the main passenger exit. They were wearing civilian clothes and carrying duffel bags, trying to blend in with the dock workers, but I recognized one of them. It was the woman who'd been with Dimitri the night before, the one speaking Portuguese on the radio. When a group of us tried to disembark to file a police report with local authorities, we were told that due to administrative issues, passengers from Deck 7 were temporarily restricted from leaving the ship. The hotel director himself came down to explain that this was for our protection while they worked with proper channels to investigate. But Janet had managed to slip out through a crew exit and made it to the police station, only to be told that the cruise line had already contacted them about a minor theft that was being handled internally, and that maritime law meant they had no jurisdiction unless we could prove physical assault had occurred on U.S. territory. The officers seemed strangely uninterested in taking her statement, and she overheard one of them mention something about not wanting to disrupt tourism relations with the cruise company that brought millions of dollars to their port. That evening, as we sailed away from St. Thomas, Frank organized what he called a documentation party in his suite. About 20 of us gathered with whatever evidence we'd collected: photos of damaged doors, recordings of suspicious radio chatter that some passengers had captured on their phones, screenshots of crew social media posts, and written accounts of everything we'd witnessed. A woman named Dorothy, who worked as a paralegal back in Indiana, helped everyone write detailed statements with times, dates, and specific descriptions. We used Frank's military-grade satellite phone, which he'd hidden in a locked Pelican case, to upload everything to a cloud server and email copies to the FBI, Coast Guard, and several news outlets. The ship's administration must have figured out what we were doing, because suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the hotel director appeared with 4 security officers, including Dimitri, claiming they'd received a noise complaint, and that gatherings of more than 10 passengers in a single cabin were against safety regulations. They tried to confiscate our phones and cameras, saying they needed them as evidence for their internal investigation, but Frank stood his ground, reminding them that they had no legal authority to seize personal property without a warrant, and that any attempt to do so would be considered theft. Ironic considering the circumstances. For the remaining 3 days of the cruise, it was basically a standoff. They couldn't throw us off the ship without creating an even bigger incident, and we couldn't force them to properly investigate their own crime ring. But here's what ended up happening. When we finally docked back in Port Canaveral, there were 2 FBI agents and a Coast Guard investigator waiting at the gangway, thanks to Frank's connections and the evidence we'd transmitted. 17 passengers from Deck 7 filed official complaints, and the local news picked up the story after Paul leaked it to a tech journalist friend who had a huge Twitter following. The cruise line initially tried to spin it as an isolated incident involving a single rogue employee. But when the FBI found over $200,000 in stolen goods in a crew storage area and detected that the security system had been deliberately sabotaged using admin access codes, they had to open a full investigation. 3 months later, I got a call from a federal prosecutor telling me that 11 crew members had been arrested, including 2 security supervisors and a guest services manager who'd been running this racket on multiple cruise lines for years, specifically targeting elderly passengers with valuable anniversary or retirement gifts. The cruise line quietly settled with all the victims out of court, paying way more than what was stolen just to keep us from talking to more media outlets. Though obviously that ship has sailed, pun intended, since I'm sharing this story now. I was fresh out of high school when my closest friends and I decided to book a cruise as a graduation trip. There were 5 of us: Ethan, Claire, Jordan, Emily, and me. And we figured a week at sea would be the perfect way to mark the end of one chapter and the start of another. My life back then was simple: part-time job at a grocery store, college applications hanging over my head, and that restless energy of wanting something bigger. The cruise was supposed to be our escape, one last stretch of freedom before responsibility caught up with us. The ship itself felt like a floating city: bright casinos, all-night buffets, pools stacked on different decks. We spent the first couple of days bouncing from one activity to another, barely sleeping, drunk on the novelty of it all. But the vibe shifted late one night when Claire and I wandered past a staff corridor near the lower decks. We weren't supposed to be there, but the door to a service stairwell had been left propped open. That's where we heard 2 crew members talking in hushed voices. Their accents were different, but one phrase cut through clear: "The morgue compartments are already too full." At first I thought I'd misheard. A morgue on a cruise ship wasn't something I'd ever considered. Claire grabbed my arm, eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" We stood frozen in place, listening. One of the men sighed and said, "We'll have to mark the rest as medical incidents. No space left." They moved farther down the hallway before we could catch more. Claire wanted to bolt back upstairs immediately, but I convinced her to act normal. We told the others what we heard, and Ethan laughed it off, saying every ship had a morgue for emergencies. Jordan, though, looked unsettled and muttered, "Too full? That doesn't make sense." The strangeness turned into something darker a couple of nights later. Emily got into a heated argument with a bartender after she accused him of shortchanging her. She wasn't drunk, just stubborn and loud when she felt wronged. A supervisor stepped in, a tall man with slicked back hair and an expression that stayed unreadable no matter what Emily said. The fight fizzled out eventually, but not without her muttering she'd report him to guest services. That was the last time we saw her. The next morning, her bed was empty, her phone left charging by the nightstand, and none of her belongings looked disturbed. We reported Emily missing right away, but the response from the staff felt rehearsed. The supervisor she argued with claimed she'd been seen leaving a lounge with new friends around midnight, even though none of us remembered her saying anything about meeting anyone. The ship's security assured us they'd make announcements and check surveillance, but no announcement ever came. When we pressed again, they insisted she must have disembarked during a port stop, something that didn't add up, since all of her things were still in the cabin. It felt like we were being pacified instead of helped. That night, Ethan suggested we split up and quietly look around the restricted areas. He was half joking, but the longer we sat in that tiny cabin staring at Emily's untouched shoes by the door, the less like a joke it felt. Jordan managed to charm a cleaning lady into pointing out where the crew's access elevators went. Claire and I took one of them down, timing it between staff runs. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the carpet giving way to plain steel floors. When the doors opened, the smell hit us first. Industrial cleaner mixed with something metallic and sour, faint but undeniable. We didn't get far. A man in uniform rounded the corner, eyes narrowing the second he saw us. He asked what we were doing there, his voice calm but with an edge that made it clear we weren't welcome. Claire blurted something about being lost, and he walked us back up without another word. The silence on that elevator ride was suffocating. He didn't scold us, didn't threaten us, just stared straight ahead like we didn't exist. When we returned to the cabin, Ethan and Jordan were waiting, pale-faced. They claimed they'd overheard 2 crewmen talking by the loading bay about moving another one before morning. By the following day, rumors started circulating among passengers. Someone said a young woman had fallen overboard. Another insisted it was a medical evacuation. None of it matched what we knew. When we asked security again about Emily, they repeated the same vague line about her choosing to leave. Jordan lost his temper and shouted at them, only to be threatened with confinement for disrupting order. That's when it clicked for all of us. Emily wasn't coming back, and whatever was happening below deck was being carefully hidden behind official-sounding excuses. Ethan insisted we had to get proof, even if it meant risking being caught again. That night, we waited until the hallways were quiet and slipped back toward the service elevators. Jordan had swiped a room key left unattended on a cart, which surprisingly worked on the lower levels. We kept our phones ready, flashlights off, hearts pounding so hard I could feel mine in my ears. The air down there wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, the kind of atmosphere where every sound echoes too loudly. Behind one locked door, faint humming of machinery mixed with what sounded like refrigeration units. When we reached the end of a narrow corridor, we saw a metal door slightly ajar. Ethan nudged it open just enough for us to peek inside. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls, and in the dim light we caught the unmistakable sight of toe tags. There were more than I could count in those few seconds. Claire let out a gasp that she couldn't stifle, and the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. A shadow moved in the reflection of the steel. Someone had been inside. Without saying a word, we bolted back to the elevator, praying the stolen key still worked. It did, but just barely. The next morning, security knocked on our cabin door. They claimed an incident report had been filed against us for trespassing in restricted areas. We played dumb, insisting we'd been in the casino all night, but the officer's eyes lingered on each of us long enough to make it clear we were being watched. The rest of the cruise blurred into paranoia. We stuck together constantly, avoided staff, and barely spoke above a whisper in case someone was listening. Emily's name never appeared in the daily bulletins. It was as if she'd been erased. When the ship finally docked, we packed up and walked off without looking back. No one contacted us, no investigation followed, and her disappearance was eventually dismissed as a runaway case. Even now, years later, the sound of those crew members whispering about compartments too full hasn't left me. I can still see Emily's phone, screen glowing with a half-written message she never sent. We told her parents everything, but without proof, it sounded like wild paranoia. And maybe that's what the ship counts on, that people like us go home, too scared and powerless to fight back. I booked that cruise because it was the cheapest way to see a bit of the world during my college break. The ship wasn't fancy by any means. Paint chipped in a few places, corridors narrow enough that two people had to shuffle sideways to pass each other. But I figured it didn't matter. My cabin was small, with a single bed pressed against the wall, a desk with a loose drawer that squeaked when I opened it, and a porthole that looked out onto nothing but endless gray water. It wasn't glamorous, but for someone traveling alone on a tight budget, it felt like enough. I spent the first day exploring, eating at the buffet, and reminding myself this was supposed to be relaxing. On the second night, I returned to my cabin after dinner and noticed a small folded piece of paper lying just inside the door. At first, I thought maybe housekeeping had left a note about towels or something trivial. But when I unfolded it, the words were handwritten in shaky block letters. "Don't trust the crew." That was it. No signature, no explanation, nothing else. I remember staring at it for several minutes, trying to decide whether this was some stupid prank, or if it was even meant for me. The handwriting looked rushed, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. I slipped the note into my backpack and tried to brush it off, but the thought of it followed me around the ship. Every time a crew member smiled and asked how my day was, I wondered if they knew something I didn't. I tried to act normal, but I found myself scanning faces, watching body language, noticing details I would never usually notice. A man polishing glasses at the bar who never once looked up, a steward in the hallway who seemed to hover outside certain cabins for longer than necessary. It felt like I'd been pulled into some secret I wasn't supposed to know. By the next morning, another note appeared under my door. This one said, "They'll deny everything. Stay quiet." That rattled me more than I want to admit. I finally worked up the nerve to take both notes to the purser's desk, thinking someone would take it seriously. Instead, the woman behind the counter gave me a polite laugh, said passengers sometimes imagined things at sea, and told me not to worry. She slid the notes back toward me as if she didn't even want to hold them. Walking away, I felt embarrassed, like I'd been dismissed as paranoid, but a part of me couldn't shake the warning. After that encounter, I tried convincing myself it was just someone's idea of a joke, but things started to feel different around the ship. During breakfast, I noticed a guy I'd chatted with the day before, a student from another state traveling solo too, wasn't at his usual spot. I figured he overslept, but then at lunch he wasn't there either. By dinner, his chair remained empty, and no one mentioned him. No announcement, no casual, he disembarked early. He was just gone. The next day, it happened again with a woman I'd seen frequently reading by the pool. She always wore this wide-brimmed hat, easy to spot in a crowd. Suddenly, she wasn't there anymore. Her lounge chair stayed empty, her towel never picked up. I remember walking the deck in circles, half expecting to catch sight of her somewhere else, but she had vanished just as completely as the first guy. At that point, I started paying closer attention to who was traveling alone. A few of them simply stopped appearing. That night, I returned to my cabin and found a third note pushed under the door. My chest tightened the moment I picked it up. This one read, "You're not next, yet. Stay alert." That word, yet, sat in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. I barely slept, and every time I heard footsteps outside my door, I stared at the crack of light under it, waiting to see if another shadow paused there too long. The hum of the engines that once felt comforting now sounded like a warning, constant and heavy. I tried reporting it again, this time to a different officer at the reception desk, but he just brushed it off as seasickness messing with my head. "People get restless out here," he said, practically ushering me away. I walked off, clutching the notes, feeling both foolish and terrified. If the crew wouldn't believe me, who was I supposed to trust? The ship felt huge, but suddenly it was shrinking around me. Every hallway another place someone could be waiting. Every closed door a reminder of those passengers I never saw again. By the fifth day, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The dining hall felt emptier, though no one else seemed to acknowledge it. Families laughed, couples posed for photos, and the crew kept smiling like nothing unusual was happening. I kept scanning for familiar solo travelers and coming up short. The absence was deafening. My own meals turned mechanical. I barely tasted the food, too focused on counting who was still around. Late that evening, I caught sight of two crew members guiding a young man I'd noticed traveling alone toward a stairwell at the far end of a corridor. He didn't look drunk, but his steps were unsteady, like he was reluctant to follow. When he glanced back, his face carried something I'll never forget, like he wanted to call out but knew it wouldn't matter. Before I could react, the crew ushered him around the corner and out of sight. That was the moment I knew the notes weren't just warnings. They were facts. I spent the rest of that night barricaded in my cabin, dragging the desk and even the chair against the door. Every creak in the hallway made me hold my breath. No new note appeared, but that almost made it worse. The silence pressed down harder than the scribbled threats ever had. I didn't sleep until the sun filtered faintly through the porthole, turning the ocean pale blue. The ship docked 2 days later, and I walked off with nothing but my backpack, barely stopping to breathe until I was on solid ground again. To this day, I don't know what happened to those missing passengers. No official report, no news stories, nothing I could find afterward. It's like they were erased. I still have the 3 notes tucked inside a notebook at home, the handwriting uneven and smudged where my fingers clutched them too tightly. Sometimes I wonder why whoever wrote them chose to warn me at all. Maybe I was just lucky. Or maybe I was one step away from being the next name nobody ever mentioned again. I signed up for that cruise because it was the cheapest option my friends and I could find. And honestly, it felt like the kind of spontaneous trip college kids are supposed to take. We weren't chasing luxury, just a chance to be out on the water, sharing a cramped cabin, splitting costs and pretending we were adults on vacation. I remember the ship looking older than I expected when we boarded. The paint dull, the metal railings already showing patches of rust, but we laughed it off. At that point, the only thing on my mind was how surreal it felt to be out at sea with my friends, away from assignments and campus noise. The first 2 days were uneventful, just sun, crowded buffets, and awkward conversations with strangers at shared tables. I spent most of that time with my roommate for the trip, Leah, who had this restless energy, always darting off to explore different decks, always dragging me along to see the view from up here, or what's happening down there. She kept saying it felt like something was brewing, pointing out how the sky never seemed fully clear, even when everyone else was sunbathing. I shrugged it off, assuming she was just overthinking. We were young and convinced nothing serious could touch us out there. Everything shifted on the third night. Dinner had just ended when an announcement crackled over the speakers, cutting through the usual chatter. The captain's voice was steady but clipped, telling us that a storm had taken an unexpected turn. It wasn't supposed to be anywhere near our path, but now it was heading straight for us. People laughed nervously at first, but when the crew started handing out instructions with tight expressions, the tension spread fast. Leah gave me this sharp look like she'd been right all along, and for the first time, I felt the air in the ship thicken with dread. By midnight, the ship was no longer gliding, it was groaning. Each swell hit us like a giant hand shoving the entire vessel sideways. Hallways tilted, plates shattered somewhere below us, and every wall seemed to rattle in protest. The lights flickered on and off until eventually they cut out completely. Imagine hundreds of passengers stumbling in total darkness, the sound of water rushing where it shouldn't be, and the metal around you straining with every wave. I clutched the railing outside our cabin door so hard that my knuckles went numb, convinced the next crash would split the ship in half. Leah and I tried to make our way toward the stairwell, but the floor pitched so violently that we slid into the wall more than once. People were shouting in the dark, voices echoing off the narrow corridors, some calling for family members, others just screaming with each jolt. A crew member passed us with a flashlight, barking instructions that were lost under the crash of water slamming against the hull. For a moment, I could smell the seawater before I felt it. Cold, rushing under the cabin doors, spreading fast across the carpeted hallway. We finally reached a railing near one of the main decks, clutching it alongside dozens of strangers who all wore the same expression of raw fear. The ship tilted so far that the horizon outside looked vertical, a wall of water looming higher than anything I thought possible. Every impact made the metal under our feet shriek, like the vessel itself was crying out. I remember gripping Leah's arm so tight that she yelped, but neither of us dared let go. It felt like the only thing keeping us tethered to reality was that railing. The blackout stretched on, broken only by the weak glow of emergency lights that flickered sporadically, never enough to see clearly. Somewhere deeper inside, alarms wailed in uneven bursts, then cut out abruptly. I kept thinking about how no one had prepared us for this. Cruises had safety drills, sure, but nothing about standing in darkness while waves tossed the ship like a toy. Each second felt like it might be the last before something gave way, before we were all swallowed whole. Hours blurred together in that chaos. Time didn't move normally. It stretched and warped with every groan of the ship's frame. At some point, Leah whispered, "We're not making it out of this." And I couldn't bring myself to argue. I just pressed my forehead against the cold metal railing and listened to the water slam and recede, over and over like the countdown to something final. I thought about my parents, about the ridiculous decision to save money on this trip, about how no one on land even knew what we were going through in that exact moment. When the storm finally eased, it wasn't a gradual calm. It was like the sea suddenly exhaled. The violent shudders became dull tremors. The crashing turned into uneasy lapping, and for the first time in hours, silence spread across the decks. Emergency lights flicked back on, revealing pale faces and soaked clothes. People clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, even though we were technically still afloat. I remember releasing the railing and being surprised my arms still worked, every muscle stiff from holding on. The crew eventually guided us back toward the interior, though most of the hallways were ankle-deep in water. Cabin doors hung crooked on their frames, and belongings floated past like debris in a flooded basement. Leah and I stumbled into our room to find our beds overturned, the ceiling tiles sagging from leaks. The air smelled like salt and diesel, sharp and heavy, sticking to my lungs with each breath. I don't think I slept at all that night. I just sat upright, waiting for the ship to start shaking again. The next morning, we learned that the storm had changed course so suddenly that the captain had no choice but to ride it out. Some people called him reckless, others called him a hero, but none of that mattered to me. What mattered was that the ship had held barely, and that I had stared at the ocean in its most violent form, and lived to tell about it. I remember watching the sunrise from the deck, the horizon calm and golden, as if the nightmare hours before had been a hallucination. But the warped metal railings and shattered windows were proof it had been real. Even now, years later, I can still feel that night whenever I hear strong winds outside my apartment, or when I walk past a building creaking in bad weather. It's not just the memory of fear, it's the helplessness, the realization that you're at the mercy of forces far bigger than yourself. That trip was supposed to be carefree and cheap, just another story from college. Instead, it left me with a memory I can't shake, of clinging to cold metal in the dark, waiting for the sea to decide whether I would live or not.